The Iraq War is, for many of us, not quite history. It lives in the space of recent living memory, a place where the passage of time has not yet allowed emotion to cool. In fact, feelings still burn red hot. As one goes further back in history, conflicts become detached from the partisan political struggles that consume so much of our daily lives and generate such visceral reactions. For most consumers of history, the fact that David Lloyd George was a member of the Liberal Party, as opposed to a Tory, is not a meaningful element of Great War history. It would be fair to assume that for most World War II buffs, if Winston Churchill was actually a Labour Prime Minister, the way they conceptualised the war would be completely unchanged. Iraq, however, is such recent history that it is still deeply embedded in the partisan struggles of today. Many of those watching this video will remember the Bush presidency, and their political affiliation will, to a very large degree, frame their understanding of the war. This remains true even if you are not an American, as the war was deeply polarizing all over the Western world. Indeed, in nations like Australia and Britain, who were active participants in the conflict, Iraq was very much Tony Blair and John Howard's war. But more than partisan politics, perhaps the defining feature of the Iraq War, at least in terms of its popular and non-specialist historiography, is the manner in which it was justified. We all desire a just war, especially when so many young men and women served in Iraq, and over 5,000 gave their lives in pursuit of victory there. This is, of course, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who lost their lives as a result of the American-led invasion and ensuing civil war. When a conflict claims such a high price in blood and treasure, there is a natural desire for a just casus belli. The strategic imperative advanced by the Bush administration justifying the invasion of Iraq was the danger posed by Saddam's weapons of mass destruction arsenal, specifically his chemical weapons stockpile. In a post-9/11 environment, it was argued, the United States could not tolerate a hostile regime with such a vast WMD capability, as an act of chemical terrorism could well make 9/11 look like a comparatively minor incident. As we now know, although there were some chemical weapons in Iraq, these were simply remnants of a stockpile and capability that had largely been destroyed by 1999. These two features of the Iraq War, its proximity to contemporary partisan politics and the question of the United States' justification for the war, make it a difficult topic to engage with for the military historian. In my experience, any discussion of the conflict immediately dissolves into an argument about the war's justification, its moral and legal status, and the truthfulness of the Bush administration. Obviously, when so much blood has been spilled in so recent a memory, the fact that the general public may well have been lied to in the weeks and months leading up to the war, the notion that the war was begun under deliberately false pretenses, can be all-consuming. Ultimately, we may never know exactly how much of this episode can be explained by the quite well-documented intelligence failure, and how much was purely the neoconservative elements in the Bush administration pushing for a plausible pretext to remove Saddam Hussein by force of arms, a policy many had been advocating for years. Where someone will fall on that spectrum will, again in my experience, be largely determined by their politics and wider worldview. As important as these questions are, they can, for these reasons, poison a technical military analysis of the war, obscuring a fascinating and historically vital conflict, one which in many ways defines the unipolar moment and post-Cold War global order. Thus, for this reason, the following discussion will not address the question of how truthful the Bush administration was prior to the war. I am a military historian, and this channel is dedicated to serious military history. Therefore, not only will any discussion of the war's casus belli be unproductive, it will detract from the wider purpose of this video. What follows is a military history of the Iraq War, one that is purely concerned with an analysis of the campaign that is firmly rooted in military history and strategic studies. It is simply not a politico-military history. Such discussions can be left to those who have both the aptitude and interest. Although questions of Washington's strategic calculus cannot be completely ignored, the fundamental question of what actually drove Bush's decision to invade Iraq will not be addressed here. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commanding general of US Central Command, flew into Sorfan Air Base in southern Iraq. As he arrived at Sorfan, a facility that had only been captured by coalition forces 2 days earlier, Schwarzkopf and his staff prepared for a meeting of real historical significance. Awaiting them in a tent at the edge of the airfield was Iraqi General Sultan Hashim Ahmad al-Tai. Both men were shocked by the circumstances which now confronted them. Schwarzkopf had faced a formidable challenge. Ba'athist Iraq was one of the most significant military powers in the world. When it invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Iraq possessed the fourth largest army in the world. It fielded over 60 divisions, more than the United Kingdom during the Great War. Although technologically the Iraqi army may have lagged behind the premier Soviet formations, it was armed and equipped primarily with Soviet equipment and utilized Soviet doctrine. Indeed, most Iraqi divisions were certainly comparable to second or third echelon Soviet formations. Its spearhead Republican Guard divisions were more comparable to elite Soviet units. Prior to the commencement of Operation Desert Storm, areas of central Iraq were more heavily defended from air attack than Moscow or Eastern Europe. Furthermore, the Iraqi military had been hardened by the fire of 8 years of high-intensity war with Iran, one of the 20th century's forgotten conflicts. This immense, battle-hardened and reasonably well-equipped force had enjoyed some 5 months to fortify their positions. The coalition forces that were led by General Schwarzkopf, spearheaded by the US Third Army, had no right to expect the campaign to liberate Kuwait to be anything other than a brutal slogging match, one that would certainly be costly in Allied lives. What actually occurred was one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history. After a 39-day air campaign, arguably the most effective application of air power in all of military history, the Iraqi army was routed in a land campaign that lasted just 100 hours. After feinting towards the primary Iraqi defensive line along the Kuwaiti border, the coalition executed a left hook through the impassable desert of central Saudi Arabia, culminating in the daring attack by the 18th Airborne Corps, which severed the primary ground lines of communication between Baghdad and Kuwait. The desert here is nearly impossible to navigate, as there are very few roads and settlements. But the Iraqis had not really understood the revolutionary impact of satellite navigation. Completely outflanked and outmaneuvered by Schwarzkopf, the Iraqi military collapsed. Some 20,000 Iraqis were killed, with over 50,000 captured. In response, coalition losses amounted to 245 killed in action. Although Schwarzkopf did not know it at the time, the surrender he signed with General Hashim Ahmad al-Tai on the 3rd of March 1991 was nothing more than a minor interlude in what would be a quarter-century of constant conflict between Iraq and the United States. Put simply, the fighting did not end with the Iraqi surrender. In fact, from the opening blows of Operation Desert Storm, the United States has been fighting in Iraq for some 30 years. There are still US forces there in 2024. Allied success in Operation Desert Storm was largely the product of nearly 2 decades of technological and doctrinal development by the United States military. Although many have derided the capability of the Iraqi military in the subsequent years, this is nothing more than an ex post facto justification of Iraq's defeat, an attempt to diminish the importance of Desert Storm. It was undeniably a revolutionary event, one that caused a wholesale re-evaluation of fundamental doctrinal concepts that were the foundation of Chinese and Russian military strategy. Of course, Allied victory was expected, but the ease with which such a large and battle-tested army was eviscerated by the Third Army was a truly shocking event in Beijing and Moscow. Conventional conflicts in the early Cold War had demonstrated that an adequately armed force that could generate sufficient mass could outweigh any possible technological lead a smaller force could realistically have achieved. For example, despite their massive advantage in air power, the Allied armies could not counter the sheer scale of Chinese forces in Korea. The PLA, and the Soviet army to a much lesser degree, calculated that even if they lagged behind the Western powers in specific areas of military technology, large enough forces could overcome these deficiencies. Desert Storm shattered these assumptions. There are 2 primary elements which are foundational in understanding American success in the Gulf War. The first is something called the second offset strategy. The Soviet Union was a truly formidable enemy for Washington to deal with. Although the United States was a larger nation than the Soviet Union, with a larger population and higher GDP, the nature of the Soviet economy and system of government allowed it to maintain colossal military forces. In fact, the USSR was one of the most militarized nations on Earth. Various estimates place direct Soviet military spending as high as 20% of GDP, which balloons to 40% when industries that are connected to the military are included. As a percentage of the Soviet economy, this level of military expenditure was more than double the United States military budget. In essence, the highly centralized and authoritarian communist government could keep the Soviet economy on a permanent war footing. Although this colossal level of peacetime military spending was one of the reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, for the preceding 40 years, it posed a colossal security challenge to the Western Allies. Warsaw Pact forces were not only extremely heavily armed, they outnumbered NATO formations by 3-1 in Europe. The United States could simply not allocate enough economic resources during peacetime to match these colossal Soviet forces. In order to solve this problem, the Americans relied on offset strategies. The main idea of an offset strategy is to leverage technology to offset your enemy's superior forces, redressing a force ratio disadvantage. The first offset strategy was developed during the 1950s. Predictably enough, it centered on the use of nuclear weapons, an area of technology where the United States had a significant advantage. Nevertheless, by the 1970s, the Soviets had achieved nuclear parity. The development and proliferation of the intercontinental ballistic missile, the hydrogen bomb, and gargantuan nuclear stockpiles had eroded the nuclear advantage once enjoyed by the Allies, and the status of mutually assured destruction that now existed between the nuclear powers had also eroded the deterrent effect of NATO's nuclear arsenal. After all, if a nuclear exchange was likely to lead to mutual annihilation, just how likely was a NATO nuclear response in the event of a conventional conflict with the Warsaw Pact? Thus, the United States needed a new, second, offset strategy to redress the disastrous force ratio facing NATO and Germany, something that was only underlined by the drastic reduction in military expenditure after Vietnam. The second offset strategy specifically aimed to leverage the United States' technological strengths to gain a significant lead over the Soviets in several key areas of warfare: sensors, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, precision-guided munitions, stealth, and communications. The primary idea was that, although the United States could not hope to maintain sufficient forces to match the Soviets during peacetime, if the Allied armies were enabled by these new technologies, they would stand a good chance of defeating these much larger Warsaw Pact forces. Although this initiative began in the early 1970s, arguably its fruits were only realized during Operation Desert Storm. Technological development alone is useless if it is not supported by advances in doctrine that are designed to leverage the new capabilities provided by breakthrough technologies. After all, if the force operates in exactly the same way, the benefits of technological development are unlikely to be realized. The technological advances delivered by the second offset strategy were accompanied by a revolutionary doctrinal concept called air-land battle. Released in the 1982 doctrinal publication FM 105, air-land battle completely upended traditional US doctrine. In effect, it had changed the American way of war. Ever since Ulysses S. Grant initiated the Overland Campaign, American doctrine had been explicitly attritional. The primary guiding principle of all American military commanders, through the Civil War to World War II to Vietnam, was to bring the enemy's forces to battle and destroy them. For a nation with such vast military potential like the United States, an attritional strategy had always been a clear path to victory, as any potential enemy could either be outlasted or outproduced. But without nuclear weapons, this strategy was unlikely to work against the Soviets. Yes, in a long war, the United States would probably have the advantage, but that would not save Western Europe from immediate defeat and Soviet conquest. Really, for the first time in its history, air-land battle reoriented the US military away from attrition and towards maneuver. Maneuver and attrition are not mutually exclusive concepts. Any military strategy requires some combination of both. However, doctrinal concepts that rely primarily on maneuver aim to disrupt enemy formations by achieving positional advantage, rather than to simply destroy them. Perhaps the archetypal example of a doctrinal concept that emphasized maneuver is the incorrectly named German blitzkrieg, which is juxtaposed to the explicitly attritional French doctrine of methodical operations. Air-land battle was a doctrinal concept that fundamentally emphasized maneuver. American planners identified clear Soviet weaknesses that they believed could be exploited by these new technologies. These included predictable echelonment, centralized command and control, and rigid battle plans. Soviet doctrine, going all the way back to the deep battle concept of the Second World War, emphasized the coordination of truly colossal forces to concentrate unimaginable amounts of combat power. If allowed to operate freely, the Soviet steamroller was almost unstoppable. However, in order to achieve the coordination of such massive, heavy, and unwieldy forces, the Soviets had to rely on a relatively cumbersome command and control apparatus. Soviet battle plans had to be highly detailed, and allowing excessive low-level initiative was only likely to lead to disorganization and disorder. Attacking forces were, again by necessity, arranged into predictable echelons, with first, second, and third echelon units filling well-defined roles. This, in turn, led to a predictable tempo of Soviet attacks. Basically, in order to effectively coordinate these massive and heavy forces, many of which were composed of conscripts, the Soviet offensive had to be a well-oiled machine. A ballet of destruction, in which everyone knew their role and followed their orders precisely. Air-land battle aimed to throw a wrench into this highly oiled Soviet machine. The primary doctrinal principle which guided Allied commanders was not to kill as many Soviet tanks as possible or to try and stop them cold. It was to spread disorder and confusion, hopefully leading to the paralysis of the Soviet command and control apparatus. The way this was to be achieved was through three-dimensional maneuver, through both the land and the air. Air-land battle emphasized a pair of related concepts, the extended and non-linear battlefield. Allied commanders were trained to think of the battlefield as an area that stretched deep into the enemy rear, as far as 200 kilometers. It was this area of depth, rather than just the line of contact, where Allied forces were intended to operate. Rather than simply meeting Soviet combined arms armies head-on with the aim of stopping them cold, NATO corps commanders were to immediately feel for weak points. Deep counterattacks striking into the enemy rear were always to be prioritized. This was the non-linear battlefield in action, a series of deeply penetrating, core-level counterthrusts, rather than a traditional line of contact. The primary idea was that such a battlefield would impose so much confusion that the highly unwieldy Soviet command and control apparatus would simply be unable to adapt, leading to paralysis and panic. NATO forces, conversely, would be far more able to operate in this highly dynamic battle space. Not only was lower-level initiative far more highly emphasized in Western militaries, but NATO commanders would enjoy the technological fruits of the second offset. Empowered by pervasive sensors and digital battle networks, Western commanders would possess a decisive situational awareness advantage, which would allow them to achieve a wider positional advantage. As the name would suggest, air power was critical to the air-land battle concept. Obviously, air power has always been central to American doctrine. Indeed, the Western powers, specifically the United States and Great Britain, are primarily aerospace and naval powers, rather than land powers. Therefore, air power has always been central to the Western Allies' approach to land battle. However, under air-land battle, the application of air power moved away from attrition. Obviously, close air support and interdiction were still core missions. However, the kind of deep maneuver envisaged by American doctrinal planners was really enabled by the Western Allies' overwhelming air capability. Rather than simply acting as a force multiplier for land forces, the extended battlefield was to be exploited primarily by air power. Again enabled by pervasive sensors, stealth, and precision-guided munitions, Western air power would strike command and control facilities deep into the battle space, and air superiority would allow the maneuver of airborne and air-mobile forces into the depths of the enemy rear. The use of air power to both blind Soviet command and control and to maneuver air-mobile forces would be critical in imposing a situation so confusing and dynamic that the highly rigid and centralized Soviet command apparatus would simply cease to function. Now at full maturity, air-land battle was on full display during Operation Desert Storm. The campaign opened with a hammer blow directed squarely at the Iraqi military's central nervous system. The first night of operations saw some 2,759 combat sorties, employing every available element of coalition air power, from cruise missiles to F-117 stealth bombers to B-52s. Although the full spectrum of strategic targets were struck, the main weight of the campaign was directed at Iraqi air defences, air bases, and the Iraqi military's command and control complex. Within days, Iraq's integrated air defense system was operating under local control as the centralized command apparatus had been destroyed. The combination of new platforms, such as the F-117 Nighthawk, with pervasive sensors, such as the Joint STARS airborne radar aircraft, and the heavy use of precision-guided munitions, including the Paveway laser-guided bomb, allowed for the most impressive application of air power in modern history. Within a week, the Iraqi integrated air defense system was utterly ineffective, and Allied air forces were able to operate at high altitude with absolute impunity. Even before the majority of air defense systems and fighters were destroyed, the lack of centralized command and control had left them impotent, and the Allied fighters were free to turn on the Iraqi ground forces. When the land campaign came, it also showed the fruits of the Allied shift in doctrine. Rather than the straightforward, attritional approach which the Iraqis clearly expected, Schwarzkopf unleashed a rapid and deep series of maneuvers. In just 100 hours, the 8 Iraqi corps in Kuwait and southern Iraq were completely outmaneuvered. The powerful 7th Corps, the main Allied strength, sliced through the Iraqi right flank like a lance, driving over 200 kilometers in 4 days, simply bypassing their main concentrations. The 101st Airborne Division conducted the deepest and largest helicopter air assault in history. The division moved its battle forces over 250 kilometers into Iraq, reaching the Euphrates River and cutting Highway 8, the primary Iraqi ground line of communication. They were just 150 kilometers from Baghdad. The Iraqis were absolutely stunned by these maneuvers. Before their main force had even been engaged, the 7th Corps had turned their right flank, and Allied air assault forces were operating deep in their rear area. Paralyzed by the speed, precision, and lethality of Allied forces, savaged by Allied air power, and without any effective centralized command and control, the Iraqi army collapsed. The combination of extremely rapid maneuver and precision strikes on Iraq's command and control complex, enabled by the attainment of air superiority, induced a fatal paralysis. Saddam's forces were placed in checkmate, and less than a week after the ground campaign had begun, General Schwarzkopf was at Sorfan, taking General Hashim's surrender. As is so often the case in military history, in the fruits of success lay the seeds of future failure, and so many of the failings of the Second Iraq War can be traced back to the crushing victory in the first encounter. This is not due to arrogance or hubris, but rather a simple misunderstanding of the implications of future trends in conflict. In essence, the wrong lessons were learned. The early 1990s were a transformational time in the history of the US Army. After the long and harrowing Vietnam experience, it had become an organization that was fixated on large-scale, conventional conflict in Europe. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there was a large imperative to reduce the size of the US military and to reduce military spending generally. In 1989, the Army fielded some 18 active field divisions, but by 1995, that had shrunk to just 10. The reduction in personnel that reflected the smaller order of battle was also substantial, some 510,000 compared to 770,000. The Marine Corps also shrank by about 10%. This reduction in personnel and aggregate combat power occurred during a time where expeditionary warfare began to dominate the US military. Sustaining forces very far from their permanent bases posed additional challenges, problems that were complicated by the reduction in personnel. In order to meet this shortfall in capability, the US military relied more and more heavily on civilian contractors, many of which filled critical roles in support and logistics that had been core Army roles. Along with the political pressure to reduce the size and weight of the military, Washington now faced a new strategic epoch. The 30 years between 1991 and 2021 were a strange time within the international system. Called the unipolar moment, during this period the United States assumed a position of global hegemony. Since the Second World War, America had been the dominant Western power, but with the mighty Soviet Union acting as a counterbalance, Washington's power was certainly not unchecked. With the core mission of containment now gone, the US military assumed a far more expeditionary role, one that emphasized operations other than war, more than high-intensity military conflict. Reasonably large-scale deployments in the Balkans, Somalia, and Haiti, in addition to the constant need to deploy military forces to contain Saddam Hussein's still dangerous Iraqi regime, imposed a severe operational burden on a military force that was under significant pressure to reduce costs and personnel. As the technological advantages provided by the second offset strategy had been so decisive during Desert Storm, many military theorists argued that the fundamental nature of warfare had been changed by these new technologies. They argued that a revolution in military affairs, or RMA, was currently underway. The specific technological developments that had been fielded by the United States, especially sensors and digital battle networks, had revolutionized the fundamental way warfare was to be conducted. RMA advocates argue that these new systems and technologies had effectively lifted the fog of war, giving American commanders a god's eye view of the battle space. With this informational high ground gained, US forces would have such a massive advantage. The force multiplication effects of these technologies would be so profound that small and light American units would be able to easily defeat much larger foes. Although there were certainly RMA skeptics throughout the US Army and Marine Corps, these ideas gained ground within the fires, intelligence, and attack aviation communities. It was not just military theorists who loved the RMA concept, but the political class. The idea that these critical new technologies would allow the US military to deploy with a much lighter footprint was extremely attractive to various secretaries of defense. Donald Rumsfeld, in particular, became almost intoxicated with the notion that the technological dominance of the US military would allow future wars to be done on the cheap, with comparatively small ground forces deploying inordinate amounts of combat power. These ideas would have a profound impact on the course of the war after the fall of Saddam's regime. By 1996, these peacekeeping and low-intensity operations were consuming the equivalent of 4 of the Army's 10 active divisions. This level of deployment was basically unsustainable, as generally speaking, a ratio of 3:1 was required for long-term deployments in order to maintain standards of training. In order to generate more available forces, the Army adopted a new primary unit of maneuver, the Brigade Combat Team. With a personnel strength of approximately 3,500, these modular brigades were roughly 1/3 of a division, and contained all of the supporting assets and capabilities required to operate independently. With organic artillery, intelligence, engineer, and logistics elements, a brigade combat team could be deployed anywhere and operate alone. Nevertheless, as the structure was modular, divisions could be built from any combination of brigade combat teams, which could operate under any of the divisional headquarters. This new flexibility and modularity allowed for the US military to much more rapidly deploy its forces by increasing strategic mobility. For Operation Desert Storm, the coalition was allowed nearly 6 months to build up their forces, allowing for full divisions and corps to be moved from Europe to Saudi Arabia. This luxury was unlikely in future conflicts. The flagship of these new, more mobile formations was the Striker Brigade. Unlike armoured or light infantry brigades, these formations relied on a family of wheeled light armoured vehicles, called a Striker. Essentially a medium formation, the Striker Brigades provided a speed of deployment and number of boots on the ground comparable to a light infantry brigade, but with the tactical mobility, firepower, and protection that was more comparable to an armoured formation. These new, lighter, and more mobile formations would rely on technological advantages in ISR to maintain situational awareness, rather than using traditional combined arms organizations to conduct continuous reconnaissance and develop the situation in close contact with enemy forces, as was more typical doctrine. Thus, as the year 2000 approached, the US military was a much different beast in comparison to the army of General Schwarzkopf. It was much lighter, smaller, and even more technologically advanced, driven by a belief in the revolution in military affairs. This process of emaciation was only accentuated under the Bush administration. Much like Robert McNamara during the Vietnam War, Donald Rumsfeld was a Secretary of Defense that had very strong beliefs about the way the US military should be structured and how it should operate. A true believer in the RMA paradigm, when it came to the implications of the second offset technologies, Rumsfeld stood at odds with US Army leadership, who wanted a far more evolutionary approach. The chiefs found themselves defending legacy force capabilities, which were under severe threat of liquidation, to be replaced by cutting-edge, though generally unproven, technologies. The prospect of exchanging current capabilities for future possibilities was deeply unsettling for many within the upper command echelon. Fueled by the belief that US technology had fundamentally changed the nature of war, Rumsfeld's army would be lighter, smaller, and cheaper. Rather ironically, during the 2000 presidential campaign, Bush was deeply critical of the long-term, low-intensity deployments that had characterized US posture throughout the 1990s. In fact, during his confirmation hearing, Rumsfeld told Congress that, "I don't think it's necessarily true that the United States has to become a great peacekeeper," and later remarked about Afghanistan that he deliberately intended to keep US forces in the theatre small and to not engage in what some call nation building. Thus, the US Army of 2001 was a very different organization to that of 1991, and the fundamental assumptions and concepts that had underpinned much of its reform were about to be tested in some of the longest wars the nation had ever waged. As the US Army was reorienting its forces for future high-intensity conflict, the Iraqi army was on an altogether different course. It, too, was undergoing transformational change. Saddam Hussein learned some very different lessons from the Gulf War. The fact that coalition forces had stopped short of regime change in the wake of the devastating defeat in 1991 left him utterly bemused, as there was literally nothing he could do to defend himself. Yet, the Western Allies had stopped short of a total victory that was all but assured. What Saddam concluded from this puzzling level of restraint was that the Western Allies had no appetite for changing the regime in Baghdad, and, thus, inheriting the mess that would surely ensue. Therefore, it became a fundamental strategic assumption in Ba'athist Baghdad that, as devastating as the US-led coalition was from a military perspective, the Western powers did not pose an existential threat to his regime. Saddam calculated that the United States, scarred by the recent and harrowing experience of Vietnam, would not embark on another messy campaign of nation-building and counterinsurgency. Nevertheless, and despite the reprieve George Bush Sr. had given him, for a short period in 1991, Saddam's rule teetered on the brink. Iraq under Saddam Hussein was ruled by a political party called the Arab Socialist Ba'athist Party, a pan-Arab socialist movement that aimed to replace the colonial powers with an Arab state. In 1996, this pan-Arab movement split into Iraqi and Syrian factions, the latter of which still exists under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad. Iraq under the Ba'athists was a one-party state, one that used an iron fist to rule over a fractured nation. Iraq was deeply divided along political, sectarian, and ethnic lines. Indeed, like many post-colonial constructions, modern Iraq is riven by centrifugal forces that constantly drive it towards fragmentation. Although primarily an Arab nation, the north of Iraq is a Kurdish area. The Kurds are an Indo-European people who speak a different language and are ethnically distinct. The wider population of Mesopotamian Arabs are divided along sectarian lines. Almost uniquely for a Muslim nation, Iraq is nearly evenly split between the two great houses of the Muslim faith, Shia and Sunni Islam. Although reliable statistics are hard to find, around a third of the population are Sunni, while the other two-thirds Shia. Whilst Ba'athist Iraq was nominally a secular government, Saddam's regime was dominated by the Sunni minority. Fearful of the connections between Iraq's Shia population and the Iranian Islamic Republic, also a Shia nation, Saddam had imposed a sectarian purge, leaving the majority of the Iraqi population excluded from government. To add to this cauldron of instability, Saddam also had many domestic political enemies who were opposed to his monopoly on political power and brutal authoritarian dictatorship. For Schwarzkopf and the other Allied commanders, the Iraqi surrender at Sorfan was the end of the war, but for their Iraqi colleagues sitting across from them, it was only the beginning. On February the 15th, 1991, President George Herbert Walker Bush implored the Iraqi people to remove Saddam themselves, telling a global television audience that there is another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside. The Iraqis did just that. Within days of the March 3 ceasefire, Shia crowds and army deserters had overrun every major city in southern Iraq and were openly fighting Ba'athist Party loyalists. With the Shia now in the streets, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Badr Corps, two Iranian-backed groups that had been established during the Iran-Iraq War, crossed the border and took Basrah, Iraq's second largest city. In the north, Kurdish Peshmerga of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, or KDP, and Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, otherwise known as the PUK, took control of the major cities of Iraqi Kurdistan. The Kurds wished to create an autonomous zone in the north and punish Saddam's regime for the murderous Anfal campaign waged against them. By March the 20th, the Iraqi Intifada was in full swing, and roughly half of the country had fallen to different rebel groups. The rebellion was short-lived, however. Several elite Republican Guard divisions escaped Kuwait essentially intact and began advancing into the rebel-held territories. Neither the Kurds nor the Shia militias were a match for these heavily armed formations. As Iraqi tanks began moving into Basra, the Badr Corps fought back with small arms, but the issue was never really in doubt. American formations in southern Iraq watched as the enemy they had just defeated crushed the uprising they themselves had called for. In desperation, the rebels in Basrah called for American aid. But, again, not wanting to become embroiled in an Iraqi civil war, the coalition forces remained in their positions. This abandonment led to a generation of Shia resentment against the United States. In the north, the Kurds were in for a repeat of the Anfal campaign, an Iraqi operation that led to 100,000 Kurdish fatalities. Here, the Praetorian Republican Guard retook the Kurdish possessions with brutal efficiency. This may have included additional chemical weapon strikes on civilian areas. By April, the regime had retaken all of Iraq's major cities. Saddam's rule had been firmly re-established, and Ba'athist death squads were now roaming rebel areas, leaving mass graves in their wake. Tens of thousands of Iraqis had been killed in the Intifada, and over 1 million had fled to Iran and Turkey. Operation Desert Storm and the resulting rebellion had completely recalibrated Saddam's strategic priorities. As is often the case in authoritarian, one-party states, the interests of the party are synonymous with the interest of the state, and thus the security services generally were now completely reoriented against what Saddam erroneously viewed as the primary threat to his regime, his internal enemies. After all, the Americans had shown that they had no appetite for regime change, but the rebellion had nearly cost him everything. The 60 divisions that were decimated by the coalition in Kuwait were never fully reconstituted. The post-1991 Iraqi army shrank to 5 corps of 18 divisions and 2 corps of Republican Guard. Not only were these very large forces no insurance against Western military aggression, without the foreign military aid of both the West and Soviet Union, which Iraq had enjoyed throughout the war with Iran, these forces were unsustainable in any case. Lieutenant General Raad Hamdan, the commander of the Republican Guard, argued that the massive and heavy armoured formations that Iraq had relied upon were simply no match for the American military, given their technological advantages, and therefore there was no point building them. Iraq would be better served, especially given its new focus on internal security, by lighter formations. The greatest change in the Iraqi army throughout the decade of the 1990s was the proliferation of paramilitary forces. The Iraqi military had been dominated by the twin pillars of the Army and Republican Guard, but by 1995 these had been supplemented by other forces that were more closely linked to the Ba'athist Party itself. The largest of these new paramilitary forces was the Fedayeen Saddam, a Ba'athist militia that was commanded by Saddam's eldest son, the particularly unpleasant Uday Hussein. The fiercely loyal Fedayeen numbered about 40,000, and although most were Sunnis, a large number of Shia had been recruited from lower-class neighbourhoods of Baghdad's Saddam City, which would be renamed Sadr City in 2003. This area was essentially a Shia slum that had been created by the Ba'athist Party as a place for displaced tribesmen to live after the draining of the marshland of southern Iraq. In doing so, Saddam had destroyed a tribal way of life that had persisted for millennia. Although these new paramilitary forces may have made Saddam's regime more secure from his internal enemies, especially the feared Fedayeen Saddam, they only diverted scarce resources away from the Iraqi army, a force that was still reeling from the devastating defeat it had endured at the hands of Schwarzkopf. One of the most important developments within the Iraqi military throughout the 1990s was its Islamization. The Ba'athists were an explicitly secular party, one that had viewed the Islamist movements as a threat. Nevertheless, in an attempt to improve his internal legitimacy, Saddam began to align the regime with Islam. The National Faith Campaign included the building of mosques, the state's sponsorship of religious clerics, and the inclusion of Allah Akbar on the Iraqi flag. Saddam even ordered religious scholars to discover his supposed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. Although much of this was simply for public consumption, there were some more significant changes. Thousands of Iraqi military officers and intelligence officials were sent to study under Salafi clerics, a Sunni movement that Saddam thought of as less threatening than the Muslim Brotherhood. This would have very serious consequences after the invasion. The 12-year interlude between Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom should certainly not be called peace. With Saddam's regime still intact, there was a need to contain Iraq with US military power. For most of the decade, the US imposed a no-fly zone over large areas of Iraq, which had to be constantly patrolled and enforced. Combat between Iraqi surface-to-air missile batteries and Allied aircraft was not uncommon. As an example, in 2002 alone, Iraqi air defenders attacked coalition aircraft on 500 occasions, prompting 90 coalition airstrikes in response. Patrolling the contested northern and southern no-fly zones eventually involved as many as 200 aircraft and 7,500 airmen on a daily basis. This policing action was interspersed by more serious air campaigns, the largest of which was Operation Desert Fox. Launched in late 1998 in response to persistent interference with UN weapons inspectors, Desert Fox was a large-scale, 4-day air campaign aimed at Iraq's chemical and biological weapon capability. Over 200 Allied aircraft were involved in the operation, which led to the destruction of over 100 Iraqi facilities, including much of Iraq's WMD manufacturing capability. Ground forces were also deployed to Kuwait to deter future Iraqi aggression, which for the most of the 1990s amounted to a single brigade or armoured cavalry regiment. This force was supplemented by several battalions deployed along Iraq's northern border to protect the Kurdish refugees that had concentrated there. In all, these military operations constituted a low-intensity conflict between Iraq and the United States that lasted until 2003, a state of affairs described by military historian Richard Swain as neither war nor not war. Indeed, tensions between the Clinton administration and Iraq only grew as the 1990s drew on. Saddam was undeterred from irritating the international community writ large, specifically by taking such actions as intervening in a Kurdish civil war and constantly interfering with UN-mandated weapons inspectors. In June 1996, UN officials had destroyed a germ warfare facility in the desert 60 kilometers from Baghdad, but they were prevented from gaining access to other WMD facilities. In the pre-9/11 period, the security challenge posed by Iraq dominated the US political and strategic community. Many pundits and politicians, especially neoconservative writers such as Paul Wolfowitz, were advocating the removal of Saddam's regime by force of arms. In an example of how much Iraqi regime change had become a US strategic priority, in October 1998, the Iraq Liberation Act was passed with widespread bipartisan support. The act made regime change in Iraq an official US strategic objective, although the president was not authorized to use force to achieve it. As much as the post-9/11 fixation on weapons of mass destruction dominated the political discussion around the 2003 invasion, and indeed is still paramount in most people's conception of the war, it is perhaps not the best paradigm through which to understand the conflict. I would argue that Operation Iraqi Freedom was merely the second act in a war that had begun in 1990. And although Saddam's chemical and biological warfare capability was always of importance, it was never the driving factor behind US policy toward Iraq that the Bush administration portrayed it as. In many ways, there was as much continuity in Bush Jr.'s Iraq policy as there was radical change. With the simmering, low-intensity war with Iraq occasionally boiling over, the Pentagon began planning for a full-scale invasion. The Iraq Liberation Act had clearly shown that regime change was a strategic objective for the Clinton administration, and thus US Central Command began laying the foundations for a large-scale land invasion of Iraq. In 1999, under General Anthony C. Zinni, US CENTCOM commander, US military planners conducted Exercise Desert Crossing, which was designed to simulate an Iraqi regime collapse. The results were not positive. Zinni's planners judged that political and military planning for an invasion and post-Saddam Iraq should begin immediately because of the immense, long-term challenges regime collapse would pose. They concluded that an intervention in Iraq would be costly in terms of casualties and resources, and regime change may not bring stability because of factors including hostile neighbors, fragmentation along religious and/or ethnic lines, and chaos created by rival forces bidding for power. 9/11 brought a new sense of urgency to US planning for an invasion of Iraq. Within just 6 weeks of the terror attacks, whilst the invasion of Afghanistan was still raging, the US political and military leadership began to focus on Iraq. On the 27th of November 2001, the new CENTCOM commander, General Tommy Franks, was asked to provide updated options for a ground invasion of Iraq. He was given the following campaign objectives. 1. Iraq's regime enablers, leadership and power base destroyed. 2. Iraq's WMD capability eliminated. 3. Iraq retains sufficient forces to defend itself, but no longer has the power to threaten neighbours. 4. Iraq has an acceptable provisional government in place. And finally, 5. Iraq's territorial integrity remains intact. This request reportedly left General Franks incredulous. He and his staff were fully engaged with the campaign against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and now Rumsfeld wanted options for a completely unrelated invasion of Iraq. Nonetheless, the CENTCOM staff assembled a small team and began planning in earnest. The initial campaign plan for the invasion envisaged a single army corps, augmented by Marines, advancing out of Kuwait and only securing southern Iraq. This would act as a prerequisite for follow-on operations towards Baghdad. As the plans for the invasion of Iraq began to mature, Franks came under intense pressure from Rumsfeld and his deputy, Wolfowitz, to reduce the size of US forces. The relative ease of American victory over the Taliban, with what was primarily special forces and air power, seemed to validate Rumsfeld's belief in the RMA. He was adamant that the Afghanistan model could be applied to Iraq as well, which was a foundational assumption of the invasion planning. At every turn, Franks was implored to reduce the footprint of US forces and the timeline for their deployment. The constant back and forth between CENTCOM and the Secretary of Defense consumed valuable planning time. The second assumption that underpinned the campaign was that the United States could simply liberate Iraq, rather than occupy it, and leave the rest to the locals. This was a favourite pet of Wolfowitz, who continually compared the operation to World War II. Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld argued that the large elements of Iraqi society that were hostile to Saddam would welcome US forces, and establishing an acceptable provisional government would not be difficult. Finally, it was assumed that the majority of the Iraqi army would not fight, and indeed much of it could be called back into service by the coalition to provide security, further reducing the need for the United States to deploy large enough forces to provide security themselves. It was these fundamental assumptions that led to the development of a disastrous campaign plan, one that had a relatively light ground force component for the invasion, a near simultaneous air and ground attack, and few forces or detailed planning dedicated to post-regime Iraq. Rumsfeld argued that just as Afghanistan had shown, the Americans would be welcomed as liberators, and the Iraqi army would be able to provide security for the new, enlightened, and hopefully democratic Iraqi government. The first pass set of plans provided by General Franks were two options, codenamed Running Start and Generated Start. The primary plan was Generated Start. Here, CENTCOM envisaged a force of 2 full corps, composed of between 5 and 6 Army, Marine, and Coalition divisions. From the President's order to initiate the operation, the Pentagon would have 90 days to deploy the first full corps to Kuwait. D-Day would commence whilst the remaining corps was en route. Maneuvers to isolate Baghdad would take approximately 45 days, with regime destruction taking an additional 90. The total campaign was estimated to last 215 days, after which time US forces could begin to withdraw. Of the two, Running Start had the far smaller footprint. The main idea of Running Start was to initiate combat operations without a lengthy deployment time. In stark contrast to Operation Desert Storm, Running Start envisaged the immediate initiation of combat operations by a force of just 2 divisions, 1 Marine and 1 Army, whilst the main combat force, a full corps, was still deploying. The air campaign would begin on day 1 of combat operations. Running Start was really more of a contingency plan, designed to enable CENTCOM to react rapidly if Saddam took some drastic action, such as initiating a spoiling attack against Kuwait. For both plans, the air campaign would begin on D-Day. This was designed to surprise the Iraqis, who would certainly expect a repeat of Operation Desert Storm. The increased precision and lethality of US air power would make a lengthy preparatory air campaign unnecessary, as air superiority could basically be achieved on day 1 or 2. Unsurprisingly, Rumsfeld had a very different vision for the campaign. He wanted far smaller forces and shorter deployment times. He argued that the contingency plan, Running Start, should be the foundational campaign plan. Rumsfeld was a micromanager. He was known to constantly send ideas to his subordinates, called snowflakes in the Pentagon, because of the avalanche of paperwork they generated. In April 2002, Rumsfeld sent Franks a paper written by Harlan K. Ullman and James P. Wade called Shock and Awe. A piece of military theory, Shock and Awe advanced the argument that rapid dominance could be achieved over an enemy by quick and decisive military campaigns. In essence, by rapidly striking the enemy with successive hammer blows, enabled by lethal long-range strike systems, a much smaller force could impose its will on a larger enemy by inducing shock and awe in the opposing command echelon. The core idea was related to the fundamental principles upon which air-land battle doctrine was built, specifically targeting the enemy command decision cycle, OODA loop, and command and control apparatus more generally. However, shock and awe took the idea to its extreme. Harlan and Wade argued that speed was much more important than mass, stating that a relatively small ground force must arrive suddenly, strike without remorse, and terminate their presence quickly, before the adversary had an opportunity to recover. Both argued that the United States could topple Saddam's regime with a division-sized element or less, roughly 10,000 troops. These ideas had a profound influence on Rumsfeld, and would thus do much to shape the campaign. Army leadership, however, was highly skeptical of the rather grandiose claims made by Rumsfeld, Ullman, and Wade. Although the core concept of the shock and awe paradigm, creating paralysis in the enemy command echelon, was generally seen as desirable, the tiny forces advocated were, they argued, both impractical and unsound. The initial force level for generated start was some 385,000 personnel. By the late spring of 2002, that force had been whittled down to 275,000, a level which Rumsfeld still called way too heavy. Rumsfeld suggested that the two brigades that were already in Kuwait, roughly 7,000 personnel, would suffice for an invasion of Iraq. Franks strongly disagreed with this ridiculous proposal, stating the rather obvious fact that even if the Iraqis chose not to fight, those forces lacked the logistics to even make it to Baghdad. In the summer of 2002, the final campaign plan was developed. Essentially a hybrid option, the new plan would try and match the speed of running start with the force levels of generated start. Initial combat operations on D-Day would be initiated by just 2 divisions, 1 Army and 1 Marine, a force of some 30,000. However, as these formations moved into Iraq, the full generated start force of over 200,000 would deploy to Kuwait and follow the spearheads, all of which would be operational within 2 months. If possible, a division-sized formation would attack through Turkey and into the north of Iraq. It had taken 9 months of arguing with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz to get even this limited, hybrid plan approved. They were 2 amateurs who were enamored by the promise that the technology the United States military now fielded had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, meaning the fundamental principles of military campaigns, such as sustainment, logistics, force protection, and projection, no longer mattered. To Rumsfeld, Franks and the army leadership generally were preparing to fight the last war. They were stuck in an antiquated paradigm that prevented them from seeing the revolutionary implications of the technological lead the United States had now acquired. The old rules that dominated Frank's planning no longer applied. Events would show just how mistaken Rumsfeld was, as even the hybrid plan he derided as still being too heavy would prove to be woefully adequate as 2003 turned into 2004. In any case, the constant back and forth consumed so much planning time, and the timeline for the invasion was constantly being reduced, that almost no time and resources had been expended on what turned out to be the most critical part of the campaign, actually securing Saddam's WMD capability and Phase 4, post-hostility operation. When Franks returned from meeting the president in June 2002, he announced to his staff at CENTCOM that it was no longer a matter of if they were going to invade Iraq, but when. Clearly, the decision had been made long before Colin Powell made his infamous speech to the UN Security Council, or UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix presented his report on the state of Iraq's WMD program, both of which occurred in February 2003. Evidently, Iraq's WMD program was not the primary factor driving US policy towards Iraq, at least not in the way it was portrayed to the public. In fact, barely any planning time was devoted to dealing with Saddam's WMD infrastructure once the regime fell, an indication of just how low a priority this actually was for the administration. Saddam was slow to realize the danger he was now in. As these fateful decisions were being made in Washington, the Ba'athist regime was still squarely focused on its internal enemies. Iraq's wider military and security posture was still centered on regime survival rather than conventional conflict with the United States. The Iraqi military was organized in concentric rings radiating out from Baghdad, Saddam's center of gravity. The regular Iraqi army was deployed along the south and eastern borders, covering Kuwait and Iran. The closer one moved towards Baghdad itself, the stronger the defenses became, with the internal security services, the Fedayeen Saddam, elite Republican Guard divisions, and the majority of the air defenses all concentrated there. Despite the tough sanctioned regime, the Iraqis had improved their integrated air defense system with dedicated fiber optic communications linking surface-to-air missile batteries with a centralized fire control complex. Although the scale of Iraq's IADS was certainly smaller than it had been in 1991, and the Iraqi Air Force was basically non-existent, what was left had all been concentrated around Baghdad. In the south of the country, there were 2 Iraqi corps facing Kuwait, and a number of Republican Guard formations had been deployed to keep an eye on the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. The interwar years had been hard for the regular Iraqi army. Shattered by the defeat it suffered at the hands of the coalition and starved by years of tight sanctions, its morale was low and equipment, which although was not altogether outdated in 1991, had not been markedly improved. It was still generally fielding last-generation Soviet armament, such as the T-72 main battle tank and BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. These were certainly still serviceable platforms, but they were no longer at the cutting edge of military technology. Older platforms, such as the T-55, were also fielded. Iraqi formations were heavily armed, however, with a large contingent of main battle tanks, towed artillery and infantry fighting vehicles. Primarily composed of conscripts, these regular army divisions were generally of a low fighting quality, and US planners expected many of these formations to surrender rather than fight. Saddam fielded 16 regular army divisions arrayed in 5 corps, with a total strength exceeding 300,000. The Republican Guard divisions were, however, far more formidable. Composed almost completely of contract soldiers, these formations received better pay, more training, and the best equipment available to the regime. They were Saddam's primary form of regime security, protecting him from both internal rebellion and any attempt at a coup. The Republican Guard was under the command of Saddam's son, Qasr Hussein. Iraq fielded 6 of these divisions deployed in 2 corps, about a single field army's worth, with a total strength of some 70,000. The final major element of the Iraqi military, the paramilitary Fedayeen Saddam, were generally dispersed amongst Iraq's major cities. The Fedayeen was really more suited to counterinsurgency, adept at using brutal violence and indiscriminate killing. They were ideologically motivated and loyal to the regime, but generally lacked the heavy weapons required to take on a Western military in a heads-up engagement in an open field. They were, however, more dangerous in the cities, where the urban environment provided cover. In all, including the other security services, Saddam deployed a force of roughly 500,000 men. Although the majority were of dubious value, even at maximum strength, the coalition forces would be outnumbered 2-1. In the opening phase, that force ratio would be approximately 5-1. Such was the technological and qualitative advantage enjoyed by the United States and its allies. By late 2002, even Saddam began to realize his enemy's intentions. Once their position in Kuwait was secure, the United States and United Kingdom began a very public campaign to gain support for an invasion, both to their domestic political audiences and the international community. Despite the decade of conflict with the West, Saddam had not really prepared the regime for the storm to come. US restraint in Desert Storm and operations such as Mogadishu had convinced him that Washington was incapable of sustaining even a moderate level of military casualties, and thus was so risk-averse that an invasion was all but impossible. This was a fatal mistake. It was only a matter of months before the war that direct planning for the defense of Iraq began. Saddam's defensive concept for the campaign was a form of defense in depth. He would array his forces in a series of concentric circles, or rings, with his elite units concentrated around regime strongholds, such as Tikrit and his center of gravity, Baghdad. Iraq's geography meant that these rings were really just a series of defensive positions along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the south of Baghdad, and a comparable series of positions guarding his northern flank, around Mosul and Kirkuk. Generally speaking, Iraq is its rivers and river valleys. This is where the population is, and it is in these areas that the major road networks are. To the west is the endless western and southern desert, and the east are the mountains of Iran. Iraqi command was concerned about an attack from Jordan, as US forces began to concentrate there, and some limited formations, called the Western Desert Force, were dispatched to guard this axis. Saddam assumed that he would lose territory in the south, but concluded that it would take coalition forces several months to breach his southern defences and threaten Baghdad, which would buy him significant time to garner support in the international community. Many major powers, including US allies such as France and Germany, were vocal critics of the invasion, and Saddam was counting on his ability to bring diplomatic pressure to bear on the Bush administration. Iraq's military leaders were much more sanguine. Lieutenant General Kenan Mansour Khalil al-Ubaidi, the dean of the Iraqi Military Academy, later remembered that, "We military officers knew that the war was coming and that it would be the end. I knew US forces would go for Baghdad, and those forces would go all the way. We also knew of the US fighting capabilities." Both Saddam and his generals were in agreement about one thing. The invasion would only come after a long air campaign in the vein of Desert Storm. To counter this threat, Iraqi command decided to disperse their forces, supply dumps, and command and control facilities as widely as possible. They judged that the Americans would attack along 3 primary axes of attack, which would all converge on Baghdad, from Turkey in the north, driving along the main highways that ran from Mosul to Kirkuk, from Jordan in the west through Ramadi, and then the main effort from Kuwait. In the south, the major ground lines of communication ran through Basrah, Iraq's second city, and then split, with highways leading to Nasiriyah and Amrah, before converging on Kut and continuing up the Tigris to Baghdad. These assumptions were badly flawed, and it was only on the very eve of the invasion, when it finally became clear that Turkey would not allow US forces to attack from the north, that Saddam actually reinforced his southern defences. In what was actually a very skillful and well-executed operation, the whole Nebuchadnezzar division of the Republican Guard left their vehicles in place at Kirkuk and quietly moved to the Babel province near Karbala, a large-scale troop movement that went completely undetected by the coalition. Despite these defensive plans and maneuvers, the simple reality was the Iraqi military was completely unprepared for the storm that was about to be unleashed upon them. Despite their relatively small numbers, the coalition forces that were gathering in Kuwait represented a truly awesome concentration of military power. Whether the revolution in military affairs turned out to be myth or reality, the simple fact is the combination of pervasive sensors, digital communications, and precision-guided munitions had a profound impact on the Western way of war, especially in the use and utility of air power. These systems, technologies, and platforms acted as force multipliers, drastically increasing the combat power a certain platform or formation could generate. As opposed to the nearly 30 Iraqi divisions under Saddam Hussein, just 4 coalition divisions were concentrated in Kuwait. On the left flank was the US 5th Corps, which would advance up the Euphrates towards Karbala and Najaf. There were 2 formations under the 5th Corps headquarters, the 101st Airborne and 3rd Infantry Divisions. The 101st was composed as an air assault formation, meaning the division would conduct airborne operations by helicopter. Whole battalions could be inserted by helicopter hundreds of miles behind enemy territory, which was a key capability underpinning US doctrine. The main body of the 5th Corps was the heavy 3rd Infantry Division, which in many other armies would be considered an armoured division. In 2003, the division fielded 3 combined arms brigades, including 4 regiments of tanks and 6 regiments of mechanised infantry. The 2 divisions complemented one another. The 101st would conduct deep air assault operations that would pave the way for the armoured spearheads of the 3rd. To the right of the 5th Corps was the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, the main component of which was the 1st Marine Division. This formation would be responsible for engaging the major formations of southern Iraq, the Iraqi 3rd and 4th Corps, establishing a bridgehead over the Euphrates at Nasiriyah, and then driving onto Baghdad through the Tigris River Valley. Baghdad, Saddam's fortress and centre of gravity, would then be attacked by a pincer, with the 5th Corps advancing up the Euphrates and the 1st MEF along the Tigris. On the right of the Marines was a British formation, the 1st Armoured Division, which would attack towards the city of Basrah. A 5th was planned to enter Iraq from Turkey, the 4th Infantry Division, augmented by the 173rd Airborne Brigade. However, this operation was cancelled when the Turkish Parliament withdrew its support for the invasion. The 10th Special Forces Group would, however, begin operations in Iraqi Kurdistan. These forces would be rerouted through Kuwait and enter Iraq as second echelon formations, reinforcing and exploiting the advance made by the first 4 divisions. These units were under the 3rd Army's Coalition Forces Land Components Command, an army-level headquarters that coordinated the operations of all large units of manoeuvre. 5th Corps was the only Corps-level headquarters, as both the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and UK 1st Armoured Division operated directly under Coalition Forces Land Component Command at CENTCOM. This American-led coalition was really more of an Anglo-American alliance. Operating alongside the Americans was a significant British contingent, centred on the powerful 1st Armoured Division, with Special Forces and Royal Marine elements in support. The British contingent made up a full quarter of the initial attacking force, and constituted the Allied right flank, which would advance on Basrah, Iraq's second city. This would become Britain's tactical area of responsibility throughout the war. The other major coalition partners were Australia and Poland, both of which deployed significant Special Forces contingents. Australian Special Air Service patrols, serving alongside their British and American counterparts, were operating inside Iraq in the weeks prior to the invasion. For a period in February, an Australian SASR patrol was the closest Allied element to Baghdad. Both the Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force contributed fast jet elements. Supporting the coalition armies was a powerful concentration of air power. At its peak, coalition air forces deployed some 1,801 aircraft, including tactical fighters, bombers, tankers, and ISR aircraft. In all, the US Air Force contributed some 863 platforms to the campaign, with the remainder taken up by US Navy and Marine Corps units. US allies, primarily Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force squadrons, contributed some 80 tactical fighters. The naval power allocated to the operation was no less formidable. By March 20, 2003, there were no less than 5 US Navy carrier strike groups operating in the Persian Gulf, with the carriers USS Kitty Hawk, Constellation, Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and Harry S. Truman, all operational in the theatre. These carrier forces were supported by 4 amphibious-ready groups composed of 7 major amphibious ships, either LHDs or LHAs. Providing escort for these carrier and amphibious forces were 5 nuclear attack submarines, 9 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, 15 Arleigh Burke and Spruance-class destroyers, and 6 Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates. Undeniably, it was not only the coalition's commanding technological superiority that allowed for the invasion to be conducted with such small ground forces, but this awesome mass of air and naval power. The preliminary air campaign that everyone had assumed would come before the invasion began on March the 9th, 2003. However, it was not the mass PGM bombardment that the Iraqi generals had imagined. Rather than laser-guided bombs, the Americans were dropping leaflets. These small paper documents urged Iraqi soldiers to capitulate rather than fight. Special forces operating in northern Iraq delivered signed letters to couriers who were supposed to take them to Iraqi army generals, offering them immunity if they surrendered to the coalition. Others warned Iraqi officers and men not to destroy oil infrastructure or employ chemical weapons. The success of these psychological operations was, at best, patchy. Although very few oil wells were destroyed by the Iraqi army, this may be explained by Iraqi officers simply ignoring commands from Baghdad, and, in the end, most Iraqi units decided to fight rather than surrender. Although some units faced widespread desertions after the leaflet drops, the expected large-scale capitulations did not materialize. Post-war interrogations showed that threats from the regime prevented many from leaving their posts, and that the Arabic on the documents was so poor that many Iraqis were confused as to what they were being told to do. The leaflet campaign did have one unintended impact. Iraqi generals and officers were reportedly badly shaken by the accuracy of the leaflet drops. Coalition aircraft dropped the unguided PDU-5B leaflet dispenser right on top of supposedly well-camouflaged fighting positions and divisional headquarters. If the Americans could drop paper so precisely, what would happen when they switched to high explosives? Things came to a head on the 17th of March 2003. Speaking on national television, President Bush announced the United States' intention to go to war with Iraq. Citing UN Security Council Resolution 1411, which, when read favourably, authorised the use of force to disarm Iraq, Bush presented the Iraqi regime with an ultimatum. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. It was, in essence, a declaration of war. On the evening of the 19th of March, the coalition had received intelligence that Saddam and his sons would be staying at a bunker complex just outside of Baghdad called Dora Farms. Briefing the president, the CIA believed an effective strike now could decapitate the regime, possibly ending the war before it had begun. They assessed that Saddam would be there between 1 and 3 a.m. local time. Bush agreed to an airstrike, but decided to wait until the 48-hour ultimatum had passed. At 4:30, a pair of F-117 Nighthawks prowled the dark sky over Baghdad. Each one carried a pair of 2,000-pound EGBU-27 laser and GPS-guided bunker-busting bombs. At 4:42 a.m., these weapons impacted the Dora Farms complex, leaving nothing more than a massive crater. But not only was Saddam not there, the command bunker did not exist. The first blow struck in the Iraq War was, perhaps, paradigmatic of the conflict as a whole. The technological brilliance of a PGM strike by stealth aircraft in the heart of Baghdad, still one of the most heavily defended pieces of airspace in the world, combined with an abject intelligence failure. It was a taste of what was to come. In response to the strike on Dora Farms, Iraq launched a barrage of 17 Scud missiles at coalition bases in Kuwait, all of which either missed their targets or were shot down by ground-based air defense systems. Saddam now knew that the war had begun. CENTCOM's original plan had envisaged a 9-hour air bombardment prior to the initiation of the conventional ground campaign, supplemented by a large-scale Special Forces insertion 48 hours prior to both. Nevertheless, the strike at Dora Farms had necessitated a change in plan. Not only were the Iraqis now fully aware of the coalition's intentions, UAV footage showed what appeared to be attempts to destroy oil infrastructure in southern Iraq. With time now against him, Franks decided to act. He ordered the ground forces to attack before the air campaign had begun. Right as the coalition armies began preparing to advance out of Kuwait, General Franks was informed that British forces may have to be withheld. British Prime Minister Tony Blair faced a mutiny within the Labour Party, one that nearly brought down his government, and there were questions in London over the legality of military action against Iraq. With just 24 hours' notice, Franks was informed that a quarter of his heavy forces may have to remain in Kuwait. General Abizaid, the Deputy Land Force Commander, concluded that the loss of the British division would jeopardise the whole mission. It was only 6 hours before coalition forces crossed the border that CENTCOM got final confirmation that British forces would participate in the invasion. Protecting Iraqi oil infrastructure was a key coalition objective, as using oil revenue to fund the reconstruction effort was a key element of the campaign plan. Thus, with the detected threat to oil infrastructure in the south, the 3rd Army Combined Forces Commander, General David McKiernan, decided to attack as soon as possible, ordering the 3rd and 101st Divisions and 1st Marine Expeditionary Force to move rapidly to their attack positions. The border between Iraq and Kuwait was defined by a high sand berm, which had to be physically deconstructed before coalition forces could advance. Once sufficient holes had been made, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines crossed the border into Iraq. The time was 4 a.m., March the 21st, 2003. Because of the complex targeting plan, the Coalition Forces Air Component Commander, Lieutenant General T. Michael Buzz Mosley, could not bring forward the air campaign. Thus, to the shock of the Iraqis, for 17 hours the heavy coalition ground forces attacked into Iraq without major air support. This proved to be a stroke of genius. The leaflet drops had supported Saddam's assumption that the initial Allied blow would be struck by the air forces, with a lengthy air campaign followed by a limited ground offensive. Thus, none of the Iraqi force commanders were expecting to fight a land battle on the 21st of March. Many fled at the mere sight of the heavy mechanized brigades advancing upon them. By attacking early and without air support, CENTCOM had achieved strategic surprise. As soon as the Allied forces crossed the burn, they began attacking rapidly towards their objectives. Indeed, over and above the surprise of a land invasion without an air campaign, the ability of coalition forces to maneuver also came as a shock to the Iraqis. On the right flank, the US Marines and 1st Armoured Division began advancing on Al-4, Qasr, and the Rumaila oil fields. The first unit to make contact with Iraqi forces were British Royal Marines. Aided by Special Forces and the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit, 3 Commando Brigade advanced on Qasr, Iraq's largest port. The Iraqi 51st Mechanized Division was rapidly pushed back, with several bridges taken by coalition forces. However, as they entered the city, the Marines faced determined resistance. Throughout the 23rd, an intense pitched battle was fought in the industrial area between USMC elements and Iraqi infantry, who held their positions resolutely. Pinned down by sniper and machine gun fire, the Marines were unable to advance. Only after several Special Forces teams, both Navy SEALs and Polish Grom elements, launched a night assault was the town cleared. Although some Iraqis had surrendered, clearly many were determined to fight. With Qasr handed over to British forces, the 15th MEU rejoined the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force as it secured the southern oil fields and drove on its first major objective, Nasiriyah, leaving the city of Basrah to the 1st Armoured Division. Apparently, the ground force commander had expected British forces to advance with the Marines towards Nasiriyah. However, they were ordered by their own national command to focus on Basrah. On the left flank, the 5th Corps began rapidly advancing north. General McKinnon responded by directing the 3rd Infantry Division, 5th Corps' main effort, to attack towards Talil airfield near Nasiriyah. Here, the 3rd Army intended to establish its main logistics base to support the drive on Baghdad. Nasiriyah is the key to southern Iraq, a major road junction. From this city, the 2 major highways, the only major axis of advance, branch out, with one leading north to the Tigris River at Kut and the other following the Euphrates River to Karbala and Najaf. Once these areas had been taken, the pincer attack on Baghdad would be possible. As the powerful 3rd Infantry Division approached Nasiriyah, it encountered the remnants of the Iraqi 11th Division. In a one-sided battle, the heavily armoured 3rd Division routed their Iraqi opponents. Advanced sighting and targeting systems gave US armour a critical advantage in open terrain. Whilst the armoured columns were preparing to move over the burn and advance on Nasiriyah and Basrah, quietly some 31 American, British and Australian Special Forces teams entered Iraq. One of the major concerns facing CENTCOM operational planners was that Iraq would fire ballistic missiles at Israel from its western desert area, and thus a heavy Special Forces presence was inserted into western Iraq. Supported by coalition air power, these small teams had effectively conquered this vast and sparsely populated area well before the war had begun. One British SAS element inadvertently clashed with Iraqi Special Forces, who were on their way to link up with the Iraqi Western Desert Force. After a fierce battle, the outgunned and outnumbered British operators were forced to withdraw, and some ended up across the Syrian border. Several Special Forces elements crossed into Iraq from Saudi Arabia, with the objective of seizing the strategically vital H2 and H3 airbases and Haditha Dam. Special Forces and air power have a powerfully synergistic relationship. As one of these teams advanced on its objective, it encountered a large concentration of Iraqi armour. Using laser designators to directly guide munitions, in one night they were able to destroy 17 ZSU-23 anti-aircraft artillery systems and 23 other Iraqi vehicles. In the north of the country, several Special Forces teams had linked up with Kurdish forces from the Kurdistan Democratic Party and Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. These elements would prove invaluable to the Kurds, providing both enhanced firepower and access to Allied air support. The Special Forces teams in Iraqi Kurdistan would eventually be reinforced by the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which would be inserted by a combat jump on March the 26th. With coalition forces already advancing on Basrah and Nasiriyah, the belated air campaign began. Saddam and the upper Iraqi command echelon had simply not appreciated how much had changed in the air domain by 2003. Obviously, the Iraqi military was a much smaller target in comparison to Operation Desert Storm, but the precision of the coalition forces, in combination with pervasive ISR, had alleviated the requirement for a long and attritional air campaign. In 1991, the Allied air forces had to take apart Iraq's integrated air defense system piece by piece, first attacking radar installations, surface-to-air missile systems and air bases with large strike packages, and only then moving on to IADS command and control. It was only once the integrated air defense system itself had been degraded that the weight of coalition air power was shifted to targets of strategic importance. It was only in the later stages of the air campaign, once air superiority had been achieved, at least over 10,000 feet, that the ground forces were subjected to large-scale bombardment. In 2003, however, these strategic targets were struck on the first night of the campaign. The significantly increased precision and lethality of Allied air power, in addition to the non-existent air threat, alleviated the requirement for a month-long preliminary bombardment. Although PGMs like laser-guided bombs stole the headlines in Operation Desert Storm, the vast majority of the munitions expended were not precision-guided. Rather, they were simple iron bombs. As an example, only 5% of all ordnance used in 1991 were the laser-guided paveway. By 2003, only 30% of all bombs dropped were not precision-guided. During the whole campaign, some 8,618 laser-guided bombs and 6,452 GPS-guided JDAMs were expended. These accounted for over 50% of all weapons used. The greater use of PGMs meant that fewer aircraft could effectively hit more targets more precisely. Only 293 US Air Force fighters were deployed in support of the operation. Additionally, the introduction of new standoff weapons, such as the AGM-154 joint standoff weapon, allowed non-stealthy aircraft to more effectively strike heavily defended targets. In combination, these new technological developments allowed for an air campaign that was much more compressed. The targeting information available to CENTCOM air planners was later described as exceptional. In stark juxtaposition to 1991, coalition intelligence staff had spent a decade cataloguing critical regime infrastructure. Iraq's defences were also far less formidable, with most of its 300 or so strong air force considered inoperable due to a lack of spares and the number of radar-guided surface-to-air missile systems being whittled down to 60 by nearly constant low-intensity combat with US aircraft. However, Baghdad itself was now more formidable than it was during Desert Storm, as the Iraqis had concentrated their air defense systems there. It was still one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. Nonetheless, the initial tempo of air operations over the first 40 hours was modest, as most focused on supporting Special Forces operations. There was some hope that war could be averted, but with the strike on Dora Farms and the early advance of the heavy ground forces, it quickly became clear that such hopes were unlikely to bear fruit. The full air campaign began exactly as originally planned. Hour was 9 p.m. Baghdad time on the night of the 21st of March. That evening, coalition air forces flew more than 1,700 sorties, with 700 strike sorties hitting over 1,000 target aiming points. This was in addition to a volley of over 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Political targets, command and control installations, ammunition and fuel bunkers, IADS elements and air bases. These were all struck in the first evening. One of the main reasons why hour could not be altered was the complex airspace management that was necessitated. The coalition air forces included flights from the carriers, Kuwait, air bases in the Gulf, the United Kingdom, and even continental United States, with aircraft as varied as the B-52 Stratofortress and Tornado GR-4. Although air supremacy was not officially declared until the 16th of April, the first few days of operations were so successful that General Franks was able to tell Secretary Rumsfeld that the coalition had achieved air supremacy in the battle space by the evening of March the 19th. The impact of this initial bombardment was crippling. With centralized command and control essentially obliterated, and major regime figures moving from place to place in fear of their lives, the conduct of the Iraqi defensive devolved to the local division commanders. In such an environment, the maneuver of large units was essentially impossible. The Iraqi military had been paralyzed. Although the rapid advance of Third Army's armoured spearheads had completely wrong-footed the Iraqis, who had assumed any large-scale ground offensive would only come after a lengthy aerial bombardment, Franks and CENTCOM were also surprised by Iraq's defensive strategy. CENTCOM planners had assumed that, much like Operation Desert Storm, the main engagements would take place with large concentrations of Iraqi armour. Franks expected the toughest fighting would be in pitched battles with Republican Guard divisions in the open ground along the major ground lines of communication between Baghdad and southern Iraq. But as the 3rd Infantry Division advanced on Nasiriyah, it was not the tanks of the Republican Guard's Medina Division that US Special Forces observed moving south through the Karbala Gap, but trucks full of men in black shirts. The lightly armed but fanatical Fedayeen Saddam were moving to the defense of the southern cities. These formations had no intention of engaging the Americans in a tank battle in open ground. They would use the urban environment to try and hold the South. One of the reasons why the major land battles in Operation Desert Storm were so one-sided was the advantage Western forces had in long-range engagements. The combination of thermal imaging systems with fire control computers allowed Western tanks to effectively engage Iraqi armoured fighting vehicles at a range where they were basically immune from return fire. This is one of the reasons why coalition forces suffered so few casualties. However, when operating in an urban environment, the engagement ranges shrink substantially, simply because of the constrained lines of sight. This range compression removed much of the long-range advantage enjoyed by coalition forces, and although they were generally victorious in these fierce urban battles, they began to suffer casualties. Coalition forces first began to encounter these new tactics in Nasiriyah, Samawa, and Zubair. In accordance with the operational plan, the 3rd Infantry Division remained outside of the city of Nasiriyah proper, bypassing it and leaving blockade forces to the south and east, as well as securing a crossing over the Euphrates. The first major combat formation to enter the city was Task Force Tarawa, composed of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Richard F. Natonsky. Natonsky's orders were to hold the Highway 1 crossing and secure a further 2 bridges in the eastern part of the city, which would facilitate the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force's drive to the north. He was to do this without getting bogged down in urban combat, as the city itself was to be bypassed rather than secured. As the heavily armed Marines rolled through the city, they were met by a barrage of artillery and small arms fire. Rather than main battle tanks, they were engaged by groups of light infantry, moving around in pickup trucks with makeshift heavy weapon mounts, a vehicle known as a technical. Despite their general lack of modern heavy weapons, the Fedayeen put up tenacious and ferocious resistance, and what was supposed to be a quick dash for the bridges soon turned into what McKiernan described a damn tough urban fight. The Fedayeen actually employed a coherent and well-rehearsed infantry doctrine that emphasized asymmetric tactics. They would attack in small groups, in an apparently haphazard faction, before melting back into the civilian population. Most wore civilian clothes. They operated from Ba'ath Party headquarters, mosques, hospitals, and schools, not hesitating to use human shields, knowing that coalition air power would be reluctant to strike these targets. In general, the Fedayeen were suicidally brave, showing a fighting spirit that the regular Iraqi army lacked. There are numerous reports of viciously close fighting between coalition units and paramilitary elements. As they wore civilian clothes, many Fedayeen were able to crawl or walk right up to American tanks and armoured fighting vehicles, requiring crew members to fight them off with pistols and even Iraqi AKMs. As the British 1st Armoured Division began advancing into Iraq's second largest city, Basrah, they too encountered the Fedayeen Saddam. After coming under heavy fire from men wearing civilian clothes around the Sunni-majority suburb of Zubayr, British forces decided to halt and focus on reconnaissance, setting up several checkpoints and isolating the area. With such a large civilian concentration, British local commanders determined that careful tactics were warranted. During the course of the day, a pair of Iraqi army regulars surrendered. They were able to provide accurate intelligence on the Republican Guard, Fedayeen, and Ba'ath Party headquarters and strongpoints inside Zubayr. Under the cover of darkness, where the threat of civilian casualties would be lowest, the division conducted a series of nighttime raids. Rolling in with heavily armoured columns, British forces hit these critical Iraqi targets. Although the defenders put up staunch resistance, they were unable to deal with the firepower of British armoured forces. All the major targets were cleared, leading to the destruction of ammunition stockpiles and inflicting significant enemy casualties. By daybreak, all British forces had evacuated Zubayr and were back at their start lines. Back in Baghdad, Iraqi Central Command began hearing reports that coalition forces were simply bypassing the southern cities, especially Nasiriyah. They were astonished that US forces were apparently leaving these urban centres completely uncontained, with all heavy forces of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force and 5th Corps apparently moving north. This left coalition ground lines of communication running along highways 1 and 5 vulnerable to interdiction. Although the centralized command and control apparatus of the Iraqi military had been badly disrupted by the initial air bombardment, the unconventional communications utilized by paramilitary forces were far harder to disrupt. Using civilian phones to coordinate, large Fedayeen elements began moving south towards Nasiriyah. The coalition's vast and hugely impressive intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability struggled to track these paramilitary forces. For example, the Joint STARS airborne radar aircraft gave Franks a god's eye view of the battlefield, showing the movement of every vehicle within its 50,000 square kilometre footprint. This provided 3rd Army headquarters with very accurate intelligence on Iraqi armoured formations in real time. But in a nation of 27 million people, these airborne sensors stood little chance of tracking the movements of paramilitary forces using civilian vehicles. By March the 23rd, 3rd Army headquarters concluded that the bulk of regular Iraqi army formations in southern Iraq had been destroyed or surrendered, but the local security forces, especially the Fedayeen, still represented a serious threat. This change in the composition of the enemy's forces confounded 3rd Army's operational level ISR and analysis systems, which were far more optimized to collect and display information on large conventional forces. For example, The digital battle maps at 3rd Army HQ struggled to display the large number of company-sized elements in a template that was designed to show the movements of division and corps. In fact, these shortcomings generated an outdated and inaccurate enemy picture that would persist at CENTCOM until the end of the invasion. With the coalition's heavy forces advancing in the south, Special Operations expanded their campaign in western and northern Iraq. One of their primary missions was reconnaissance. From Nasiriyah to Karbala to Najaf, Coalition Special Forces teams spent days gathering intelligence, including locating Fedayeen headquarters, artillery positions, and large-scale enemy concentrations in order to pave the way for the advance of the 3rd Infantry. With the unexpected Iraqi reliance upon irregular forces, and therefore the limitations of airborne ISR systems such as UAVs, the intelligence generated by Special Forces elements was absolutely crucial. At this time, northern Iraq was almost exclusively a Special Forces theatre, and by early April, some 50 Special Forces teams were operating alongside their 65,000 Kurdish allies and the 173rd Airborne Brigade. The Kurds were facing several heavy and formidable Iraqi divisions, including several Republican Guard formations. Special Forces were critical in enabling Kurdish victory over these forces, as they provided the firepower the Peshmerga lacked. In western Iraq, the vehicle-mounted patrols of the British and Australian Special Air Service scoured the desert searching for the mobile Scud ballistic missile launchers that CENTCOM feared would launch a chemical weapon strike on Israel. Within the first 7 days, western Iraq had been basically sanitized of major Iraqi elements. By March the 23rd, 3rd Army headquarters were forced to change their operational plan. Despite the rapid victory over the 2 Iraqi corps in southern Iraq, the paramilitary forces operating out of the southern cities posed an unforeseen threat to coalition ground lines of communication. Supply convoys moving behind the armoured spearheads came under unexpected attack, with several ambushed by Fedayeen. The worst incident occurred when the ill-fated 507th Maintenance Company, a support element of the 3rd Infantry Division, took a wrong turn. Rather than driving around Nasiriyah, the unit inadvertently drove right through the city. Although the lightly armed Fedayeen often struggled to effectively engage the heavy forces spearheading the coalition offensive, support elements posed less of a challenge. As the 507th drove through the city, they blundered into a devastating ambush. The lightly armoured vehicles were raked by machine gun, small arms and RPG fire. Within minutes, the 507th had lost 11 killed and 9 wounded, with burning and destroyed vehicles overrun by Iraqi infantry. Of the 9 wounded, 7 were captured. Amongst them was 19-year-old Private Jessica Lynch. Hailing from Palestine, West Virginia, Lynch had joined the military because her working-class mother could not afford to send her to college. Despite her relative obscurity, this incident would propel Private Lynch to become an international celebrity. News of the disaster which befell the 507th spread rapidly, and the fate of the missing Jessica Lynch captured the imagination of millions of Americans. Unlike the other casualties of the 507th, Lynch was a young and beautiful woman, and her potential fate dominated the American media cycle. Despite the widely discussed fears of her rape and torture at the hands of the Iraqi military, Lynch was simply taken to Nasiriyah Hospital for treatment. While she was recovering from her wounds there, American forces were tipped off to her presence by an Iraqi lawyer. In one of the most famous incidents of the invasion, Delta Force operators led a daring rescue operation, one that was, of course, at least partially captured on live TV. With embedded camera crews recording the drama, on April the 1st, Special Forces elements raided the hospital. They found Private Lynch in a hospital bed, being cared for by Iraqi nurses and doctors. No resistance was encountered, as the Iraqi military had abandoned the hospital and Private Lynch the day before. Despite its comparative inacuity, the capture and rescue of Private Jessica Lynch presented a golden propaganda opportunity, and its portrayal to the American people would become a symbol of the dishonesty and mistrust that surrounded the 2003 invasion of Iraq for many Americans, one that Private Lynch herself would later come to resent. Clearly, given the experience of the 507th and other support elements, some forces would be required to contain the cities. General McKiernan ordered significant elements to contain these large urban centres, including the clearing of major villages and towns that sat alongside the main highways. In Nasiriyah, most of Task Force Tarawa was ordered to remain in the city and continue clearing operations until all of the bridges over the Euphrates and Saddam Canal were secure. The Marines faced a tough, 9-day-long battle, which would eventually cost the coalition 32 killed and 60 wounded. As the Marines were facing unexpectedly stiff resistance on the streets of Nasiriyah, 5th Corps was planning its most daring maneuver of the operation. US doctrine, specifically air-land battle, which was still foundational in US military thinking in 2003, emphasized rapid maneuver and deep penetrations with the objective of disrupting the enemy command decision cycle. Air-land battle aimed to impose a rate of change in the tactical picture confronting enemy command that they simply could not react quickly enough. Just as in Operation Desert Storm, air assault operations were one of the primary methods by which these doctrinal principles were to be applied. The two divisions of the 5th Corps were designed to have a synergistic relationship. The firepower of the heavyweight 3rd Infantry Division would be married to the mobility of the 101st Airborne. Deep air assault penetrations would not only complicate the tactical picture facing Iraqi Central Command, but pave the way for the rapid advance of the armoured spearheads. On March the 23rd, the 101st prepared to undertake one of these deep strikes. As an air assault division, much of the 101st's firepower lay in its attack helicopter regiments. Fielding the deadly AH-64D attack helicopter, these formations were capable of devastating attacks on armoured and mechanised concentrations, and the long reach of the attack helicopter allowed these mass strikes to be deployed well into the deep battle area, hundreds of kilometres behind the line of contact. As the armoured columns of the 3rd Infantry Division advanced north from Nasiriyah towards Karbala, to their left, out in the desert, the 101st Airborne was busy establishing a number of small bases, refueling points for helicopters that would extend the division's reach deep into Iraqi territory. At 1 a.m. on the morning of March the 23rd, 31 Apaches of the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment took off from a forward refueling station and began flying north. Their objective was the Medina Division of the Republican Guard, specifically its 2nd Armoured Brigade, which airborne surveillance had detected south of Baghdad. If the 101st's Apaches could locate this armoured concentration, it was likely to be eviscerated in a barrage of Hellfire missiles. The attack was preceded by a substantial suppression of enemy air defence operation. F-16 CJs equipped with high-speed anti-radiation missiles, the famous Wild Weasels, swept the flight path, striking several radars and surface-to-air missile systems. These were supported by ATACMS tactical ballistic missile strikes. This was very effective, with all radar-guided SAM systems in the area either suppressed or destroyed. However, the Iraqis had become accustomed to American doctrine, and these strikes gave them ample warning that a helicopter operation was probably imminent. This was only exacerbated by a 2-hour delay, desynchronizing the suppression operation and the attack itself. Most of the flight path took the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment out over the desert, but in the Karbala Gap, there was no choice but to fly over large, built-up areas. As the regiment passed over the cities of Al-Haswa and Al-Iskandariyah, the pilot saw the streetlights below blink on and off twice, as if someone had cut the electricity for a second. Nearly instantaneously, the entire regiment was engulfed in a torrent of fire. The cities erupted with fire from small arms, machine guns, RPG, and light anti-aircraft artillery. Practically every house seemed to have someone shooting. The Apaches were easy targets, silhouetted as they were against the clouds by a bright full moon. Every single platform was hit by small arms fire. With one Apache shot down and every other helicopter damaged, the mission was aborted. Although all but one returned to base, when they arrived, the support crews found them riddled with bullet holes. One had a total of 29 impacts, but somehow had been able to keep flying. Not only had the mission been a failure, but the entire regiment had been rendered combat ineffective. It would be another 30 days until it would reach full operational capability. The Iraqis had used new and innovative tactics to adapt to US technological superiority. Although high-end air search radars and SAM systems were easy targets for US air power, suppressing hundreds of machine guns and light AAA was essentially impossible. Rather than using military communications, which were disrupted by coalition electronic warfare aircraft, the Iraqi commanders simply used telephones to communicate. Their defensive forces were simply ordered that if they saw the lights turn on and off, to begin firing, putting up a wall of lead through which the helicopters would have to fly. This need not be accurate fire if the mass was sufficient. This new Iraqi air defense system was an ingenious adaptation to the challenges the Iraqi military faced. It could not be suppressed, nor could it effectively be countered. General Wallace, the 5th Corps commander, later recalled that, From that point on, I was not at all confident we could execute a successful deep operation with helicopters, and we didn't need to. With the failed attack on the Medina division, the weather intervened decisively on the campaign. The mother of all sandstorms, as would be dubbed by Western media, descended on Iraq. In arid areas of the world, the arrival of a large gust front will often generate a sandstorm, lifting countless tons of dust, dirt, and sand into the air. On March the 24th, 2003, a particularly strong sandstorm swept across the area. With coalition forces blanketed in dust, restricting both visibility and air operations, the Third Army implemented an operational pause. Despite conjecture at the time, the campaign plan had always included an operational pause before coalition forces advanced on Baghdad proper, allowing for supporting elements and logistics to catch up with the spearheads. With this brief break in the offensive, the American commanders met to discuss their operational plan. Generals McKinnon and Wallace, 3rd Army and 5th Corps commanders, advocated a change in strategy. The Fedayeen and other paramilitary forces operating in the towns and cities were posing an unexpected problem. Along the main axis of attack, the major highways, the many towns and villages provided the Fedayeen with perfect cover for ambush and counterattack. Although they only posed a limited threat to Western heavy forces, and were often slaughtered by mechanized infantry, the lightly armed supply battalions were another story altogether. The two generals wanted to redeploy both elements of the 101st Airborne Division and the only operational reserve, one brigade of the 82nd Airborne, which was in Kuwait, to clear these towns and villages along the ground lines of communication running to the south. Franks was unconvinced of the need to do this. Back at CENTCOM HQ, the highly sophisticated computerized battle displays were not showing these paramilitary forces, all of which were hard to identify by American ISR systems. Only after a long and lengthy argument was Franks convinced that there really was a threat to coalition supply lines, one which could jeopardize the operation. With advanced elements of the 3rd Infantry Division and 1st Marine Division now on the outskirts of Baghdad's main defences, the Sandstorm provided a perfect opportunity. By the 24th, the 3rd Infantry Division was approaching the major defensive line around the Karbala Gap, and the Marines were approaching the Tigris. They were about to encounter the elite Republican Guard divisions which formed Saddam's primary defences. These areas were held by the Medina, Nida, Baghdad, and Hammurabi Republican Guard divisions. Although the progress had been very rapid, the two main drives from Nasiriyah, one towards the Karbala Gap and the other towards Kut, had left a large opening between the Marines and the 3rd Infantry Division. This was now becoming somewhat of a Fedayeen stronghold, and McKinnon wanted this area to be secured before advancing on Baghdad. Thus, the 101st was ordered to isolate and clear Najaf and Karbala, with the 82nd Airborne focusing on Samawa. With the new operational plan agreed on by all, the supporting elements of the Marine 1st Expeditionary Force and 5th Corps were rushing to catch up to the armoured spearheads. The advance had been so rapid that the combat elements of the divisions had outrun their administrative tails. A common problem during a rapid advance, the need to allow logistic and support elements to move forward is one of the reasons why attacking forces often need to pause even if enemy resistance is weak. Large forward supply bases were quickly established, and thousands of tons of supplies were moved forward along the major highways. The Sandstorm also provided some opportunity for rest. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles may be able to advance for 7 days straight, but human beings cannot, and most of the fighting men and women had been operating on very little sleep for almost a week. They would need their strength for the decisive battle to come. For the Republican Guard divisions defending Baghdad, the poor weather brought them little relief. The coalition air forces may have been unable to conduct low-level attacks, but the Sandstorm was no obstacle to higher altitude operations. In fact, it proved to be a target-rich environment for the Allied airmen. With the coalition forces now approaching Baghdad's main defensive ring, the Iraqis deployed the bulk of the Republican Guard divisions to positions to the south and east of the city. Unlike the encounters with paramilitary forces, this was the kind of enemy that the coalition's vast ISR capability was optimized to engage. Back at Coalition Air Component Command, General Moseley watched E-8 J-STAR's radar imagery that showed a clear line of armour pouring out of Baghdad, moving to new defensive positions around the city. Platforms like this gave coalition commanders an informational advantage that the Iraqis could only dream of. Compounding the problem was the fact that, unlike the first Gulf War, coalition aircraft were now able to strike through dust, sand, and cloud. American tactical fighters were now widely employing satellite-guided bombs, the Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM. Unlike a laser-guided bomb, the JDAM uses a GPS signal combined with an inertial navigation system to guide itself to the target. When combined with an aircraft's synthetic aperture radar mode, which allows the fire control radar to take radar images of the ground, coalition forces were able to hit stationary targets, such as tanks that were in a hull-down fighting position, through the sandstorm. In the end, by the time they encountered major ground forces, many Republican Guard battalions were already shattered by the impact of Allied air power. As the American generals debated their campaign plan, similar discussions were ongoing in Baghdad. Despite the deep penetrations made by coalition forces, Iraqi command was actually pleased with the outcome of the first week of fighting. Allied setbacks at Basrah and Nasiriyah had given Saddam the impression that coalition forces would hesitate to enter the major cities, especially Baghdad, for fear of sustaining casualties. The high fighting spirit of the Fedayeen had also inflated Saddam's estimation of the Iraqi military's capability. Despite these apparently promising signs, the upper Iraqi command echelon had a confused operational picture that led them to completely misjudge coalition dispositions and intentions. Saddam was convinced that he was being attacked along three major axes, from Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraqi Kurdistan. This confusion showed the value of coalition special forces, who had a disproportionate military impact. Because of the widespread destruction being wreaked in western Iraq, Saddam concluded that a conventional military force was operating there, confirming his prior beliefs about Allied strategy. He also believed that the drive on Kut by the Marines was the primary threat to Baghdad. The coalition main effort, the 3rd Infantry Division, was considered a tertiary operation. Thus, for some unexplained reason, Saddam's son Qusay denied Republican Guard requests to destroy a main Euphrates bridge leading into the Karbala Gap, a move that would have slowed the 5th Corps advance substantially. As the operational pause came to its close, Baghdad's southern defences were not substantially strengthened, with significant formations still operating to the north and west. The main southern defensive line, which was pushed as far forward as possible, was composed of 3 Republican Guard divisions. The Medina Division, which formed the right wing of the Iraqi line, defended the Karbala Gap. The Nebuchadnezzar Division, deployed near Hilla, held the centre, and the Baghdad Division faced the Marines around Kut. The 26th Division was ordered to advance into the salient between the 2 Allied spearheads and threaten their communications. Only a single regiment of Iraqi Special Forces remained in Baghdad. With the sandstorm easing on March the 27th, the coalition forces began clearing the lines of communications. Back in Nasiriyah, the Marines of Task Force Tarawa, which had been reinforced by 2 Marine expeditionary units, essentially battalion-sized battle groups, began to clear the city. As opposed to the assumption of many in both Iraqi command and the Western media, the Marines hardly shied away from urban combat. Over nearly a week of house-to-house fighting, where the advantages enjoyed by the American military, such as air power, were certainly less relevant, the Marines cleared the city. Several fierce firefights occurred near Fedayeen strongholds, such as the Ba'ath Party headquarters, but the superior fighting spirit and technical skill of the Marines quickly showed. The Fedayeen may have been brave, but they were outclassed by Western infantry, who imposed devastating and disproportionate casualties. By April 2nd, General Natonsky declared the city secure and redeployed the bulk of his forces towards the drive on Kut. By March the 28th, on the coalition left flank, 5th Corps began a 5-pronged offensive that was designed to set the foundation for an eventual attack on Baghdad itself. The 3rd Division's objective was to drive from Nasiriyah, along the west bank of the Euphrates River, through the cities of Samawa and Najaf, towards the Medina Division holding Karbala. The Karbala Gap was a good defensive position. Here the Medina Division's right flank would be anchored on the shores of Razaza Lake, with its left on the Euphrates River. In the centre of this position sat the city of Karbala itself, which would provide good defensive terrain. The only problem with this plan was the need to clear many of the towns and cities along the 250-kilometre drive from Nasiriyah to Karbala, which was diluting the power of the 3rd Infantry Division. With the sandstorm clearing, units of the 101st and 82nd Divisions relieved the 3rd Brigade, allowing it to concentrate with the rest of the 3rd Division. As the main thrust of the 5th Corps attack moved towards Karbala, the 101st Division was ordered to attack Hilla on the east bank of the Euphrates. Their objective was to threaten the central approach to Baghdad and pin the Nebuchadnezzar Division in place so it could not reinforce Karbala. This set of maneuvers emphasized the extreme dexterity of US forces. The ability of the United States military to rapidly maneuver large units and redeploy them in the theater often crossing one another in the process, without large-scale confusion or disorder, was truly impressive. This is only possible because of the technical skill possessed by the command apparatus as a whole, with mid-level commanders, even in the logistic and administrative elements of these formations, executing operational plans adeptly. With the Sandstorm now long gone and the ground lines of communication firmly secured, the advance on Baghdad began. This was the kind of engagement in which the American military truly excels. A conventional battle fought against a roughly equal force of elite armoured divisions, waged in reasonably open terrain. Here, the Americans were able to bring all of their technological, doctrinal, and qualitative advantages to bear. One small demonstration of this technological mastery occurred in early April. As the 1st Marine Division advanced towards Baghdad from Kut, its lead elements made contact with the Baghdad Division of the Republican Guard. As is typical doctrine, the Marine advance was led by lightly armed recon companies. One such element found itself about to be attacked by a heavy formation. A large column of Iraqi armour was detected advancing down the road towards them. Driving Humvees, the small Marine element stood little chance against a tank battalion. However, they were not without fire support. Within minutes, a B-52 orbiting at 30,000 feet was given target coordinates, and a pair of CBU-105 cluster bombs left its bomb bay. The CBU-105, otherwise known as the sensor-fused weapon, is a marvel of military technology. Typically, cluster bombs aim to saturate an area with smaller submunitions, the size of a mortar bomb or grenade, thereby achieving a very large area of effect. Even in their most basic form, they are devastating weapons. Large enemy concentrations are particularly vulnerable, especially when they are out in the open. One of the major moral complications of using cluster munitions is caused by their failure rate. No matter how well they are made, cluster bombs will always leave some percentage of their submunitions unexploded. These tend to act as unintentional landmines, and therefore can pose a threat to civilians for a very long time. To say the sensor-fused weapon is a smart cluster bomb would be an understatement. The bomb itself is guided to the target by the wind-corrected munitions dispenser. Much like a JDAM tail kit, this turns any cluster bomb into a GPS-guided smart bomb, greatly increasing accuracy and allowing for high-altitude employment. The 1,000-pound CBU-105 is essentially just a canister. When the weapon approaches the target coordinates, it releases 3 side panels, exposing its deadly contents. 10 BLU-108 submunitions. The 10 submunitions are released by an airbag, dispersing them over an area of some 15 acres or 61,000 square meters. After a descent by parachute, when the BLU-108 reaches a preset altitude, perhaps 100 meters, it fires a rocket motor. This rocket burn is designed to both stop the descent and cause the rod-shaped submunition to spin. Once the weapon, now hovering in mid-air, has reached the required revolutions per minute, it releases 4 smaller sub-weapons called skeets. Basically, each BLU-108 is a miniature cluster bomb. These skeets are small, puck-shaped weapons that are flung out in all directions. Each one is about 4 inches in diameter and weighs 10 pounds or 4.5 kilograms. They contain both an infrared and laser sensor, which scan a cone of ground beneath the skeet as it falls. A microprocessor within the skeet looks for either the heat of a tank engine or its outline, which is measured by the laser. If the skeet detects a tank beneath it, the weapon detonates. The skeet kills a tank by creating an explosively formed penetrator. Essentially, the explosive within the weapon both shapes and accelerates a slug of metal. This molten slug is more than capable of penetrating the weak top armor of most tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. If no vehicle is detected, the skeet self-destructs at an altitude of 15 meters. It has a failure rate of less than 1%, alleviating most of the persistent risk to civilians. In essence, the GPS-guided sensor-fused weapon is really a dispenser for 40 fire-and-forget anti-tank missiles. Just one can decimate a whole tank battalion. Needless to say, this was a devastatingly effective weapon. When the front of the armoured column that was advancing on the Marines north of Kut was decimated by the effects of 2 CBU-105s, the rest of the formation simply left their vehicles and surrendered to the lightly armed Marines, despite heavily outnumbering them. The United States military deployed weapons of this sophistication in 2003. That is the kind of technology produced by the second offset strategy. It was not only in the area of air power generally that the United States had an overwhelming technological advantage. One of the greatest breakthroughs delivered by the second offset strategy was in battle space management. The combination of digital battle networks, pervasive ISR, and computerized command and control gave American force commanders an unprecedented view of the battle space. Imaging satellites provided daily photo reconnaissance over the entire country, revealing large-scale force movements. Orbiting over Kuwait, RC-135 rivet joint electronic surveillance aircraft swept up the torrent of electromagnetic information generated by an army in the field, collecting voice communication and data links, geolocating radars and surface-to-air missile sites, and even fixing enemy headquarters. Alongside them was the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Radar System, or Joint STARS. Essentially an AWACS aircraft that monitored the ground rather than the air, the Joint STARS AN-APY-7 radar could track the movements of vehicles over a footprint that is larger than 25,000 square kilometers. By 2003, the role of the Joint STARS aircraft was being supplemented by the Global Hawk UAV. The most advanced drone in the world at the time, the Global Hawk could provide both high-resolution synthetic radar imagery and ground-moving target indicator information over a vast footprint. Unlike the Joint STARS, Global Hawk's lack of a flight crew and flight ceiling of 60,000 feet meant it could effectively operate over enemy territory, at least once the high-altitude surface-to-air missile threat had been effectively suppressed. This deluge of information was all transmitted in real time through data links, forming a digital battle network, and then collated by a dedicated command and control computer system. US generals at CENTCOM were able to view this real-time information, fused and synthesized on simple digital displays. For them, the war resembled a computer game. The Iraqi commanders, on the other hand, had to rely on paper maps, which were often updated by reports transmitted over the civilian phone network. It was as if one century was at war with its predecessor. It would be both unfair and inaccurate to simply attribute US conventional supremacy over the Iraqi military to a technological lead alone. Very clearly, across the organization as a whole, the American and British armies were qualitatively superior to their Iraqi opponents. The individual fighting men were far better trained, better equipped, had a higher morale and fighting spirit. Generally speaking, in much of the tough urban fighting where Western technological dominance mattered much less, coalition infantry consistently outfought the Iraqi military. The Fedayeen Saddam may have been fanatically brave, but when they engaged coalition infantry battalions, as opposed to support elements, they typically suffered a bloody defeat. Prone to making basic tactical mistakes, they simply lacked the technical skill to engage coalition forces on equal terms. Coalition leadership, from the small unit to the division, showed a level of professionalism and skill that was simply far superior to their opponents. This included critical supporting elements, such as logistics and administration, which allowed the divisions to maneuver with a speed and dexterity with which the Iraqi military simply could not cope. Western doctrine was also better. The effective combination of the three arms, the integration of supporting fires, especially air power, and the application of basic tactical principles were excellent across the organization as a whole. This stood for both the American and British armies and the USMC. All of these advantages manifested on the battlefields to the south of Baghdad. Rather than the long and bloody defensive battle envisaged by Saddam, American forces scythed through Baghdad's defensive perimeter in a matter of days. On March the 31st, the 3rd Infantry engaged in the long-awaited battle with the Medina Division around Karbala. At the beginning of the war, the Karbala Gap had been held by 2 Republican Guard divisions. However, the bulk of the Nebuchadnezzar Division had been redeployed to the north of Baghdad, hoping to thwart the non-existent attack from Turkey. Although the Medina Division had been under persistent air bombardment since the start of the war, the majority of its vehicles were still intact. Learning from Desert Storm, the Iraqis would build a defensive line, complete with hull-down fighting positions and decoys, and then disperse their vehicles around the towns, parking them under palm trees and next to mosques. This proved to be quite effective. Although any movement would draw withering air attacks, if Iraqi units could remain dispersed, they were spared from the worst impact of Allied air power. The coalition air commander had estimated that 80% of the Medina Division's vehicles had been destroyed, but when the battle began, the 3rd Infantry encountered hundreds of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Rather than attacking Karbala from the south, the 3rd Infantry executed a large-scale flank attack. Exploiting a gap between the Iraqi divisions, US armoured columns drove up Highway 8, bypassing the majority of the Medina division around Karbala. Again, the speed of US forces caught the Iraqis by surprise. Before Central Command had even realised the attack was underway, US forces had broken through, capturing the town of Musayyib and its all-important bridge over the Euphrates, just 40 kilometres from the outskirts of Baghdad itself. Just to the north of Musayyib is a vital road junction called Objective Saints, where highways 1 and 8 meet. Objective Saints is the key to the southern approach to Baghdad, dominating the two ground lines of communication from southern Iraq. Leading the attack on Objective Saints was a tank platoon of the 3rd Squadron, 7th Cavalry. At its very head, the lead tank in the lead company in the lead brigade was under the command of Sergeant First Class Pyle. As Pyle drove down the highway, his tank was engaged by groups of startled Iraqi infantry. Engaging these small groups of men with his coaxial machine gun, the fighting was so severe that within minutes, Pyle's Abrams had run out of coaxial ammunition. Ordering the tank to advance, Pyle manned the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the outside. The tank was raked with fire, suffering several RPG impacts. While manning the weapon, Pyle was wounded twice, including being shot in the arm. Nonetheless, he continued to man the weapon until he ran out of 50 caliber ammunition. Eventually, the Abrams sustained an RPG hit in an external auxiliary power unit, causing a fire on the back of the tank. Now out of all machine gun ammunition, Pyle re-entered the tank and ordered it to drive on, engaging dismounted infantry with his main gun. Despite being told to pull over, he continued to lead the attack. Pyle's Abrams, now on fire, would roll into Objective Saints, still at the head of the column, its 120mm main gun barking out deadly responses to the RPG teams that tried in vain to destroy it. The news that the Americans had taken Musayyib and established a bridgehead over the Euphrates shocked the Iraqis into action. Their main defensive line had essentially been breached without a major battle. The hole had to be plugged. On the night of the 2nd of April, the Iraqis decided to try their luck. Elements of the 10th and 22nd Armoured Brigades assembled for a massed armoured attack on the American bridgehead. The attack was well executed, with the Iraqis able to achieve a formidable concentration of armour. Despite its mass, the assault was savaged by the American defences. As the Iraqi T-72s approached, they were decimated by accurate tank fire. Attacking at night may well have been a hindrance rather than an aid, considering the American advantage in night vision systems. The closely packed tanks were prime targets for MLRS artillery fire, which raked the formation with hundreds of M77 submunitions. Lieutenant General Raad al-Hamdani, who personally led the attack, remembered the impact of the American rocket artillery fire. A fierce battle took place. The enemy used enormous firepower. It looked like napalm. Rocket launchers would fire groups of rockets, about 12 rockets each, that would explode in the air, burning whatever it faces on its way with its flames. Within minutes, every single Iraqi tank had been destroyed by artillery, anti-tank missile, and 120mm main gun fire. The 3rd Infantry did not sustain a single casualty during the attack. Dozens of destroyed vehicles littered the outskirts of Musayyib, and not one was American. With Objective Saints secured, most of the forces defending the Iraqi capital had effectively been bypassed. The road to Baghdad lay wide open. Seizing Saddam International Airport was a logical next step. Coalition forces would need a forward logistics base, and the ability to use the airfield would be critical in sustaining the forward elements. The airport was defended by some of the Iraqi military's finest units, a brigade of the Special Republican Guard, reinforced by a Special Forces contingent. These heavily armed formations received the best equipment available and were well trained and motivated. The attack began on the evening of the 3rd of April. The 1st Brigade conducted a combined arms attack, with tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and dismounted infantry advancing under the cover of artillery. By 11 p.m, they had breached the outer wall, and infantry companies began clearing operations. The fighting within the airport was some of the most intense throughout the whole conventional phase of the war. The defenders had dug a series of trenches, tunnels, and fighting positions, the effectiveness of which were only amplified by the large open spaces and cleared fields of fire. Clearing these features would take 2 days and require the aid of a Special Forces detachment. Here the Iraqis fought tenaciously. On the morning of the 4th of April, they conducted a fierce counterattack. Members of the 11th Engineer Battalion, who were busy constructing a holding area for prisoners, were nearly swamped by a force of over 100 Iraqi infantry. Under withering fire, the detachment was nearly overrun. It was only saved by the actions of Sergeant First Class Paul R. Smith, who entered a damaged Bradley IFV and manned its heavy machine gun. Sergeant Smith alone saved the company, breaking up the attack with 50 caliber fire until he was killed. Smith received the Medal of Honor for his sacrifice and his bravery. Although Saddam International Airport was now largely secured, there were still very significant enemy formations in the 3rd Division's rear. The majority of the Medina Division was still entrenched around Karbala, expecting an attack from the south. Their inaction, whilst American units were advancing on Baghdad, is crystalline evidence of the paralysis afflicting Iraqi Central Command. This force had to be dealt with before any attack on Baghdad could be realistically contemplated. Colonel David Perkins, commander of the 2nd Infantry Brigade, was given orders to clear Karbala and destroy the Medina Division. His original plan for the battle envisaged a pincer attack, with a cavalry squadron moving up from the south and fixing the Iraqis, whilst the heavy units attacked from the north around Musaib. In the end, only the northern pincer was able to make the attack, but this was all that was required. The 2 brigades of the Medina Division were largely intact, but both were deployed facing south. They were completely unprepared for the attack Perkins was about to unleash upon them. It began on the 4th of April. 2 tank battalions advanced line abreast, one down Route 8 and the other along Route 1. When they made contact, the Iraqis were completely surprised to see heavy forces in their rear. Tanks and IFVs scrambled to leave their fighting positions and redeploy to face the new threat, leaving them vulnerable. With T-72s and BMPs exploding around them, Medina's position melted. Within minutes, they had American tanks between their fighting positions, and command and control immediately collapsed. The attack happened so rapidly, the Lieutenant General Al-Hamdani, the commander of the 2nd Republican Guard Corps, had a tank rampaging through his headquarters. His men desperately tried to hold their positions, but with American infantry going from building to building, the staff all dropped their weapons and ran. The division had been absolutely routed. It was unable to cope with the speed of the American advance, and with its command and control paralysed, individual T-72s were forced to fight their own battles with the rampaging Americans. By nightfall, hundreds of vehicles had been destroyed, and the Medina Division had ceased to exist. As the 3rd Infantry Division was approaching Baghdad, to the south, the British were closing in on Basrah. After fierce fighting in its outskirts, especially with paramilitary forces, the 1st Armoured Division approached the larger city with caution. Basrah is a sprawling metropolis. At the time, it was home to more than 1 million people. Here the British hoped to have far more support from the local Shia population, but were concerned about the prospect of heavy urban combat in a densely populated area. Instead, the British decided to lay siege to Basrah. By March the 23rd, 6 days after the beginning of the war, the 1st Armoured Division had completely isolated the city, with elements dominating all the major approaches. But for 3 weeks, the British forces simply waited. These tactics caught the Iraqi defenders by surprise. They hoped to rely on the urban environment to counter their qualitative and technological disadvantage, but the British simply held their positions. Unable to hold their nerve, the Iraqis made several sorties from the besieged city, attacking British positions on several occasions. As could be expected, engaging British forces that were deployed on good defensive ground outside the city only led to heavy casualties. On the 30th of March, the 1st Armoured Division initiated Operation James, the first major assault into the city itself. Its objective was a suburb of Abu al-Qasib. In a careful advance, the Marines of 40 Commando, supported by armour from the Scots Dragoon Guards, engaged in fierce firefights with elements of Fedayeen. The combat here was often house to house, and several T-55s were destroyed by the supporting challengers. By March the 31st, the suburb had been secured. In response, the Iraqis attempted a large-scale breakout operation. A force of 120 vehicles in total, including tanks, BMPs and trucks, and around 1,000 infantry, concentrated and drove out of the city. The column advanced southwest towards the positions gained by 40 Commando over the previous 2 days. As occurred all throughout the war, any time Iraqi armour attempted to move, it attracted the attention of coalition air power. The formation was savaged by US Navy FA-18 Hornets and Royal Air Force Harriers, which struck the column with laser-guided bombs and cluster munitions. Reeling from these airstrikes, the armoured column dispersed into marshy ground which had seen significant rain over the previous days. Stuck in the mud, the T-55s were easy prey for the challenges of the 7th Armoured Brigade, and within 48 hours, the whole force had been destroyed. This was the largest British tank battle since the Second World War. The main concept behind the siege of Basrah was to bring about the collapse of the Iraqi forces defending the city, rather than simply destroying them. This would both reduce British casualties and limit the amount of collateral damage done to the city and its civilian population. This objective was achieved by both the isolation of the city and smash and grab raids. Typically conducted at night, British forces, usually in company to battalion strength, would enter the city, striking known Fedayeen concentrations and command posts, and then retreat to their starting positions. These operations steadily eroded Iraqi morale. By April the 6th, 3 weeks into the siege, the situation was ripe for larger offensives. In a major attack, the 7th Armoured Brigade advanced into the centre of the city. Their objective was the Ba'ath Party headquarters, the Fedayeen's base of operations. In an intense urban battle, dismounted infantry assaulted a well-constructed defensive complex of bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified houses. The area was eventually cleared, but 3 British soldiers were killed in the fighting. A force of 300 Fedayeen made a final stand at the College of Literature. In a 3-hour battle, their position was demolished by British infantry and tanks. After this defeat, Iraqi resistance was broken. To the south, the Royal Marines of 42 Commando advanced on the presidential palace. This was the probable location of the local Iraqi commander, Ali Hassan al-Majid. Known as Chemical Ali, because he orchestrated the chemical weapon attack on the Kurdish city of Halabja, Ali Hassan al-Majid was a highly feared individual, especially amongst the local Shia population. As the Royal Marines advanced from the south, the presidential palace was hit with an airstrike. This proved to be the breaking point. With Chemical Ali believed to be dead and British mechanized forces in control of the major Ba'athist facilities, Iraqi military resistance collapsed. By the evening of April the 7th, the British military was in complete control of Basrah. British tactics had been careful and cautious, but highly effective. Although certainly some Iraqi civilians had been killed in the fighting, Basrah had been taken with relatively little damage inflicted on the city itself. A more direct approach could have leveled large areas, especially considering the sheer size of the Iraqi forces holding it. In the end, the battle had only cost the British 3 killed in action. With the British now moving into central Basrah, the Americans were in a position to strike Saddam's true centre of gravity, Baghdad. Much like Basrah, taking a major city like Baghdad required a new set of tactics. Engaging the Medina division in a large-scale tank battle was one thing, but trying to use that kind of mass to conquer a city of 7 million people was not only sure to lead to widespread destruction, but reasonably heavy coalition casualties. Clearly, with the forces available to the Third Army, fighting a street-to-street battle throughout the suburbs of Baghdad was simply not a realistic option. Instead, General Wallace, the 5th Corps commander, intended to use a similar approach to the British, although with a higher and more aggressive tempo. Rather than surrounding Baghdad, the 3rd Infantry Division would establish a number of major bases on its outskirts. From these secure and highly fortified positions, heavy US formations would conduct raids into the city. Extremely powerful armoured and mechanized columns would drive into Baghdad, strike major regime targets, and then simply leave and return to base. With the immense firepower of a fully concentrated American mechanized brigade, which included over 100 main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, there would be little that could stop these raids. As they passed through the city, these powerful armoured formations would demonstrate the weakness of the Iraqi military to both Baghdad's defenders and its people. Unable to protect the very heart of the regime from US ground forces, it was hoped that the morale of Iraqi ground forces would simply collapse. Dubbed a Thunder Run by American command, Wallace intended to conduct these raids for about 30 days, after which it was hoped that the regime would surrender. The first Thunder Run was initiated on April the 5th. Rather than simply probing Baghdad's defences, the 3rd Infantry Division's commander, Major General Buford C. Buff Blount, ordered his tanks to drive right through the city. Blount was convinced that the defenders were not capable of putting up coherent resistance to his forces. Indeed, the primary Iraqi combat formations, the Republican Guard divisions, had all been deployed well outside the city. Those that had encountered US heavy forces suffered the same fate as the Medina division, with the formations to the north of Baghdad unable to redeploy due to heavy and sustained aerial bombardment. Apart from a single regiment of Iraqi Special Forces, the primary units defending the city were Fedayeen, who simply lacked the anti-tank capability to effectively engage the 3rd Infantry Division. Fresh from its victory at Saddam International Airport, the 2nd Brigade was given the task of being the first American unit to enter the city. Colonel Perkins, the 2nd Brigade commander, defined his task as to enter Baghdad for the purpose of displaying combat power, to destroy enemy forces, and to simply show them that we can. The first of these raids was conducted by the 64th Armoured Regiment. It began at the intersection of Highway 8 and Highway 1, about 7 kilometres from the outskirts of Baghdad itself. Perkins' objective was to simply move along Highway 8, passing through the Rashid district to the Tigris, and then to follow the highway to the airport, which was held by friendly forces. This 30-kilometre route would take the brigade close to central Baghdad, but keep it out of the dense suburbs. As the tanks of the 64th began rolling through the streets of southern Baghdad, they encountered determined but sporadic resistance. As they moved through the city, Perkins' tanks were engaged by one company-sized element of light infantry after another. These were both paramilitary forces wearing civilian clothes and Iraqi regulars. The fighting here was intense, and the Iraqis fought with bravery and commitment, but simply lacked the firepower to deal with the M1 Abrams. Wave after wave were engaged by the 64th, but their light anti-tank weapons had virtually no effect. Numerous tanks were hit with RPG-7 rounds, but the Abrams Chobham armour simply shrugged off the abuse. One was finally damaged when an RPG impact ruptured an external fuel tank, causing a fire. The crew were unharmed, but had to abandon the vehicle. Major Ricky Nucio described the fighting on April 5th as some of the most intense mounted combat in close urban terrain the US Army had seen since World War II. By the time the 64th drove into Baghdad International Airport, they estimated that the regiment had destroyed 50 vehicles, 25 guns, and killed 800 dismounted infantry, including capturing one Iraqi colonel. The raid had cost them 1 tank destroyed, 1 killed in action, and 5 wounded. With the success of the first Thunder Run, 3rd Army Command decided to alter its approach. General Mattis's 1st Marine Division had advanced up the Tigris Valley and was now in position to enter Baghdad from the southeast, and the whole 3rd Infantry Division was concentrated to the city's southwest. The regime's reaction to the first Thunder Run was to pretend that it didn't happen, claiming on state-run TV that there were no American forces in Baghdad. Concerned that Saddam would use any delay to strengthen his defences in the city, Wallace, Blount and Mattis all concluded that the situation demanded bold action. Making an aggressive but risky attack now may very well precipitate a collapse in the regime as a whole. A full-blown assault on the city was decided upon. On the 6th of April, in order to protect his left flank, Blount ordered the 3rd Brigade to make a left hook, sweeping around the western outskirts of the city and secure the bridges to its north. Holding these positions would be critical in isolating central Baghdad from the still significant Republican Guard formations to its north. The attack went smoothly. Elements of the Hammurabi Republican Guard Division were easily pushed aside, and by the evening of April 6th, the 3rd Brigade was in a powerful blocking position on the northern suburbs with its left flank anchored on the Tigris. Baghdad was now cut off from the remaining Iraqi forces in the north of the country. Unless these bridges could be retaken, the capital would surely fall. In order to redress this disastrous tactical situation, the remaining Republican Guard units concentrated for a breakout operation. They were able to mass a force of about a brigade strength, with armour, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, and even miscellaneous engineering vehicles. At dawn, the Iraqis struck. Moving out of Sadr city, they fell upon the 3rd Brigade's left flank, with the objective of taking the strategically vital Muthanna Bridge. In this attack, the Iraqis displayed almost suicidal bravery. Waves of armour and infantry fell upon the Americans, advancing through a heavy artillery bombardment to do so. For 60 hours straight, the Iraqis attacked, one wave after another, and despite fearful losses, they came on. At one point, the most forward units were nearly overrun and had to call down artillery fire on their own positions. In fact, the situation was so desperate that for the first time since Vietnam, artillery was used in a direct fire role. This was the most intense fighting of the entire invasion, and all throughout the attack, the possession of the bridge was in doubt. Certainly, the 3rd Brigade was now in the most dangerous situation any large American unit had faced since the invasion began, but despite the onslaught, they held. Notwithstanding the bravery of the Iraqi defenders, by concentrating their forces to the north of the city, they had left themselves vulnerable in the south. By April 7th, Perkins' 2nd Brigade was ready for another thunder run. However, this time the whole formation would attack into the city. They followed the same route as the 64th Regiment, attacking up Highway 8. This time, the Iraqis were better prepared. They had fortified the route with roadblocks and other ambush positions, but again they simply lacked the firepower to have any meaningful impact on the American armour. The fighting here was intense, with Fedayeen and Iraqi Special Forces engaging the column as it advanced, but with such a concentration of combat power, they did little more than slow the advancing Americans down. As Perkins' men reached the centre of Baghdad, instead of following Highway 8 out to the airport, they made a hard right turn. This took them into the very heart of Saddam's regime, downtown Baghdad. Here, the 2nd Brigade captured the main political and administrative facilities, including the presidential and Republican palaces. This really was the bureaucratic, political, and administrative centre of the Ba'athist regime. This time, Perkins ordered his brigade to dig in. He had no intention of leaving. This daring attack was not without risk. The 3rd Infantry Division was badly stretched, and providing security to the forces within Baghdad and keeping communications open was a serious challenge. Somehow, the forces now in the heart of Baghdad had to be supplied. There were 3 critical road junctions which ensured the ability of US forces to use the highway network within the city itself. Each was a large, cloverleaf road complex that connected Highway 8 to the other major roads. These 3 road junctions, codenamed Objectives Moe, Larry and Curly, after the Three Stooges, were all held by combined armed battle groups. If any of them fell, the 2nd Brigade would be cut off. The Iraqis hit these positions with fierce counterattacks. At Objective Curly, the junction between Highway 8 and the Dora Expressway, the 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry, found themselves in a fight for their very survival. Originally only 50 men strong, the American detachment was soon fighting a pitched battle with 500 Syrian volunteers. This close combat was fought in the rubble underneath the highway interchange. Over 18 hours, waves of Iraqi infantry assaulted the position, only to be stopped in front of the Americans' fighting positions. The 3rd Battalion became dangerously low on ammunition and fuel and was close to being overrun. This desperate situation was only rectified when a relieving unit of mechanized infantry broke through the encircling Fedayeen. 2 servicemen were killed and 40 were wounded. The other American positions all came under serious assault during the day. The brigade headquarters was also hit by a short-range surface-to-surface missile, killing 4 and destroying some 15 vehicles. But these battles were the last gasps of a dying regime. Although the Fedayeen, Republican Guard and Iraqi Special Forces units in the city were fighting hard and dying in droves, all centralized command and control was now gone. Iraq's political leadership, Saddam and his sons, had gone to ground, and the military command apparatus as a whole simply no longer existed. Every Republican Guard Corps and divisional headquarters had now been destroyed. Iraqi forces were simply attacking the nearest American units without any coordination. Although the 3rd Division was in a precarious situation, large coalition forces were now approaching Baghdad. General Mattis's Marines had not only eviscerated the Republican Guard divisions defending Baghdad's outskirts, they were now within the city itself. The 1st Marine Division had crossed the Tigris River on the 6th of April, and on the 8th they attacked into the city from the southeast. The fighting here was just as intense, but the Marines soon penetrated into inner Baghdad, linking up with the 3rd Division positions which had been under such pressure. The intervention of the Marines finally decided the issue. With the 3rd Division's communications now secure, and thousands of dead Fedayeen littering Baghdad's streets, all resistance collapsed. The Ba'athist regime had now ceased to exist. The near-simultaneous capture of Baghdad and Basrah had ended Saddam's rule almost overnight. Even though there were still large Iraqi military formations in the field, with Saddam now running for his life and much of the upper command echelon dead or missing, many Iraqi soldiers simply took off their uniforms and went home. On April the 11th, the Australian Special Forces Task Group concentrated for an attack on Al-Assad Air Base. Elements of the Special Air Service Regiment and commandos of the 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had been operating in western Iraq, hunting Scuds and monitoring the major highways to Syria and Jordan. As the operators assaulted the airbase, they found it essentially undefended. Over 50 military aircraft, including MiG-29s, the remnants of the once mighty Iraqi Air Force were simply abandoned to the coalition. Their crews, support personnel, and security forces nowhere to be found. Although there were some Iraqi forces intact around Tikrit and Mosul, Saddam's regime had fallen. The invasion was over. The conventional phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom is one of the most brilliant military campaigns in modern history, a fact that is often obscured by both the pretenses under which it was launched and the vicious insurgency and civil war which followed. Despite these obvious strategic blunders, as a pure military campaign, the invasion of Saddam's Iraq was astoundingly successful. Despite the setbacks and unexpected Iraqi defense, it had taken just 20 days to successfully invade a country of 25 million people and defeat an army some 500,000 strong. What is even more impressive is the fact that the coalition achieved this feat with such tiny land forces. When considering a force ratio required to launch an attack on a well-dug-in enemy, a typical rule of thumb is the attacking force usually requires a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers. Obviously, this does not necessarily scale up to the level of a campaign as a whole, but generally speaking, a positive force ratio is typically required. Launching a large-scale offensive with a negative force ratio is exceedingly rare in modern military history. If one side believes it has a technological, doctrinal, or qualitative advantage, then inferior numbers are acceptable, Operation Barbarossa being the primary example in the 20th century. In Iraq, the coalition successfully defeated an army of 22 conventional divisions and tens of thousands of paramilitary fighters, with just 4, eventually 5, divisions. In terms of combat forces, the coalition was outnumbered by nearly 5-to-1. Despite the disadvantage in mass, the heavy American divisions simply sliced through the Iraqi defences and pierced the beating heart of the regime, Baghdad, ending the war in less than 3 weeks. By no means was this victory won through Iraqi cowardice. The Republican Guard formations and the Fedayeen had fought tenaciously, and often with suicidal bravery. But the qualitative advantage enjoyed by coalition forces, both in terms of technology and simply the quality of the military as a whole, was simply overwhelming. The entire Medina division of the Republican Guard was eviscerated in a close-quarters tank battle with the 3rd Infantry Division. Quite literally, hundreds of Iraqi vehicles were destroyed and thousands of its fighting men fell in the Battle of the Karbala Gap. The 3rd Infantry Division, on the other hand, lost a single tank. This cannot purely be explained by Iraqi incompetence or poor fighting quality. The elite Republican Guard formations were well trained and staffed by highly motivated contract soldiers. They were equipped with the best equipment available to the regime, such as the T-72 main battle tank, which is still extensively used by both sides in the Ukraine war today. Indeed, the Medina division may not have looked all that different to Russian forces that are currently deployed in Ukraine. However, even in this kind of close-range knife fight, and despite their suicidal bravery, they were unable to lay a finger on the 3rd Infantry Division. American tanks were simply much more technologically advanced, and their command and control was so much better that they were able to outmaneuver large Iraqi concentrations, attacking them from vulnerable directions. When placed in a difficult situation, coalition forces were able to rely on fearsome fire support, both in the air and organically from the division's artillery. The accuracy and immense power of American artillery systems impressed the Iraqis as much as their air power. But technology alone cannot explain a victory as rapid and complete as this. The technical skill and quality of coalition forces really cannot be overstated. The ability of US divisions to maneuver with such speed is perhaps the primary reason for the rapid Iraqi collapse. Before Iraqi command could even react, US armoured spearheads were at the gates of Baghdad itself, and by the time they realised the danger, the 3rd Infantry Division had isolated the city. The speed of this campaign paralysed the Iraqis. They simply could not react to a situation as dynamic as this, and with command and control facilities heavily engaged by air power, the defence of Iraq devolved first to the level of the corps and division, and then to the battalion and company commander. No Iraqi officer had an accurate operational picture, and this blindness led to inaction at the operational level of warfare. Despite their smaller numbers, US forces were able to concentrate overwhelming firepower at small, critical points, giving them a tremendous advantage. Even when the entire operational plan had to be changed in order to secure the ground lines of communication, US divisions responded instantly, with formations like the 101st Airborne repositioning within hours. The speed with which US forces were able to maneuver is largely due to the quality of their supporting elements. The administrative tail of a division, its maintenance and logistics battalions, are often the least glamorous parts of an army, but it is these forces which allow the formation to maneuver. It was the speed with which supply was moved up and forward logistic hubs were established that allowed the armoured spearheads to move so rapidly and penetrate so deeply. Like a lightweight boxer, the US military moved around the ring so quickly and landed so many blows that the slow and heavy Iraqis were unable to cope. This paralysis was the core objective of air-land battle doctrine, and it had worked even more thoroughly in 2003 than it did in 1991. To be fair, some of the campaign's success has to be attributed to Iraqi weakness and incompetence. The Iraqi military had shown its willingness to fight. Indeed, it had displayed almost suicidal bravery at several places, but Saddam's defensive strategy was incoherent and unrealistic. By massing his Republican Guard divisions outside of Baghdad, he precipitated the kind of maneuver battle that his forces were completely unprepared to fight, especially against an enemy as dexterous and nimble as the Americans. As strange as it may seem, in the years leading up to the war, the Iraqi military was not preparing to fight this campaign. It was optimized to put down Iranian-backed revolts in the Shia south and the Kurdish north. Although the Fedayeen had achieved significant and unexpected success in the cities, wrong-footing CENTCOM planners, the Iraqi military as a whole lacked the command and control capability to effectively adapt to the opportunities these events provided. Obviously, coalition targeting of Iraqi command and control only aided in this process, and the whole concept which underpinned US doctrine was facilitating command paralysis. But Iraqi weakness in this area only helped this to occur. In fact, despite their superior numbers, the Iraqis were unable to mount an operational level counterattack throughout the whole campaign. In the words of the US official history, they never stood a chance. And perhaps against a more competent foe, Washington could not count on such small American forces to achieve so much. Nevertheless, it appeared as though the revolution in military affairs had been proven correct. Rumsfeld's faith in US technological superiority, and thus his deep skepticism of the requirement for a larger footprint in Iraq, was spectacularly vindicated. Rather than the 70 to 120 days that had originally been planned, the conventional phase of the war was over in 20. The invasion itself had shown vast improvements in joint and combined arms operations, and had included the largest Special Forces campaign in history. The Special Forces elements had exceeded expectations. Despite their tiny size, these units had achieved all of their objectives, effectively conquering Western Iraq single-handed. The speed and surprise wielded by Franks and CENTCOM to dismember the Iraqi regime seemed to completely validate Rumsfeld's beliefs about the nature of warfare. Speaking to the Senate Armed Services Committee, Secretary Rumsfeld argued that the invasion had shown that, in the 21st century, overmatching power is more important than overwhelming force. In the past, under the doctrine of overwhelming force tended to be measured in terms of mass, the number of troops that were committed to a particular conflict. In the 21st century, mass may no longer be the best measure of power in a conflict. After all, when Baghdad fell, there were just over 100,000 American forces on the ground. General Franks overwhelmed the enemy, not with the typical 3-to-1 advantage in mass, but by overmatching the enemy with advanced capabilities and using those capabilities in innovative and unexpected ways. Despite the overwhelming success of the invasion, there were, however, some very concerning flaws in the RMA concept which had been revealed. Firstly, the pervasive ISR capabilities that RMA advocates had argued would replace the traditional recon elements, such as the Joint Stars, were completely ineffective when the enemy was not a conventional military formation massing for a tank battle, but was rather a paramilitary force hiding amongst the civilian population. Monitoring the Fedayeen quickly became the task of special forces and recon elements. Thus, when facing an insurgent, America's overwhelming technological advantage, upon which the RMA concept was based, would be far less important. The second major flaw in Rumsfeld's reasoning became apparent in the immediate wake of the fall of the regime. With the evaporation of Ba'athist rule, including its security forces, the people of Baghdad entered the streets, not to fight the coalition, but to loot. As American forces stood by and watched, in the week from April 7th to April 14th, looters ravaged the National Museum of Iraq, the University of Baghdad, the Saddam Art Center, and two of the city's major hospitals, only one of which continued to function. On April 14, the Iraqi National Library and National Archives were burned down, leading to the destruction of countless archaeological treasures. Perhaps 100,000 pairs of boots on the ground was enough to topple Saddam Hussein and defeat the Iraqi military, but it was nowhere near a large enough force to provide security for a nation of 27 million people, one that was riven by deep ethnic and sectarian tensions. If the Iraqi army could not be rapidly reconstituted, then the resulting power vacuum would give America's enemies, both the Iranians and the jihadis, ample room to not only operate, but thrive. This was a critical window of opportunity, where the coalition could turn a brilliant operational triumph into a true strategic victory. There was even some goodwill amongst elements of the Iraqi population, especially those who had suffered badly under Saddam. But if things went badly, then the coalition could be facing a catastrophe. Yet, it was at this most critical moment that the victorious American forces seemed to have the least strategic direction. When the 5th Corps had finally seized Baghdad, its commander, General Wallace, asked 3rd Army Operations Chief, General Thurman, "Okay, Bubba, we're here. Now what?" For many coalition officers, this single sentence seems to have summed up the situation. Even as they watched crowds of Iraqis pull down statues of Saddam in Baghdad, the lack of planning for post-Ba'athist Iraq was ensuring that for the coalition, this war was not over. In fact, it was only just beginning.